He dropped his wallets on the table and said, "I'm sorry, I can't pay." 25 women had heard those exact words. 25 women had picked up their purses and walked out. Some left without a word. Some laughed. One called him pathetic before the door even swung shut behind her. Nathan Cole watched them all go and felt nothing, because none of them were real. None of them ever were. But the 26th woman didn't move. She reached into her apron pocket, untied a small cloth pouch, and set it on the table without blinking. "You'll pay next time. Today we simply finished dinner." If you've never heard a sentence stop a man's entire world, you're about to. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And leave a comment below. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Nathan Cole had not always been a man who tested people. There was a time not so long ago that he couldn't still feel the edges of it, when he believed that what a person showed you was what they were, that a smile meant warmth, that a promise meant intention, that a woman who said she loved you meant exactly that, and not the figure written in the ledger behind your name. He had been wrong exactly once, and once had been enough to change everything. The autumn of 1879 had come in hard and golden over the Montana Territory, the kind of season that made a man feel like the world owed him something good. Nathan was 36 years old, and by every measure that the territory used to judge a man's worth, he had arrived. 42,000 acres of grazing land stretching toward the Rockies. 1,200 head of prize Hereford cattle. Railroad shares that paid dividends every quarter without him lifting a finger. A stone and timber mansion in Helena with glass windows imported from Chicago and a kitchen large enough to feed 30 people on a working day. He had all of it. And he had Margaret Ashford, who wore silk dresses and laughed at his jokes and told him every time he reached for her hand that she had never met a man quite like him. He had believed her. The engagement ring had cost him 3 months of investment income. He'd had it made in San Francisco, a single oval sapphire set in hammered gold. Because Margaret had once said at a dinner party, he barely remembered that she preferred sapphires to diamonds. He had remembered. He had always remembered those small things about her. He asked her on a Tuesday evening in October. She said yes before he finished the sentence. He thought that meant something. What it meant was that in the 6 weeks between that Tuesday and the morning, she didn't appear at their planned meeting at the Helena Grand Hotel. Margaret Ashford had been introduced to a railroad magnate named Clifford Hale, a man 20 years her senior, with twice Nathan's holdings, and a house in Boston that Margaret apparently found considerably more appealing than a cattle ranch on the Montana frontier. She didn't write a letter. She sent her maid with a small envelope. Inside was the sapphire ring and 4 sentences. "I hope you understand. A woman in my position must consider her future carefully. You are a good man, Nathan. But good is not always enough." Nathan read those 4 sentences 11 times. Then he folded the note, placed it in the top drawer of his desk, and did not speak of Margaret Ashford again. He threw himself into work the way a man throws himself into cold water when the alternative is standing still and burning. He rode his land every morning before the sun was fully up. He attended to his books in the evenings. He expanded his cattle operation, negotiated new rail contracts, hired 3 additional ranch hands, and a foreman named Hicks, who had the practical good sense never to ask his employer personal questions. For a year and a half, that was enough. Then it wasn't. The loneliness didn't arrive all at once. It moved in the way a Montana winter moves gradually, then completely, until one morning you realize the cold has settled into the walls, and you can't remember what warmth felt like. He began accepting dinner invitations from acquaintances in Helena. Business dinners mostly, then social ones. The kind where there were women at the table, daughters of merchants, wives of senators, widows of cattle barons who understood the territory the way he did. He was introduced to a woman named Clara at a rancher's party in the spring of 1880. Clara was pleasant, well-spoken. She talked about horses with genuine knowledge and laughed without covering her mouth, which Nathan had always found refreshing. He asked her to dinner the following Friday. He took her to the best restaurant in Helena. Midway through the meal, on an impulse he couldn't entirely explain, or perhaps could explain too well, if he were being honest with himself, he patted his coat pocket and let his expression change. "Clara." He kept his voice level. "I'm terribly sorry. I seem to have left my wallet at the boarding house." He watched her face. The pleasantness drained out of it the way water drains from a poorly sealed bucket, not all at once, in stages, first confusion, then calculation, then something that wasn't quite contempt but lived in the same neighborhood. She picked up her wrap from the back of her chair. "I'm sure you'll find it," she said. "Good evening, Nathan." She was gone before the waiter returned with the bread course. Nathan sat alone at the table, paid for the meal from the money he'd had in his vest pocket the entire time, and drove himself home in the dark. He didn't feel angry. He felt confirmed. He tested 19 more women over the following 14 months. He was methodical about it in the way he was methodical about everything: cattle records, investment portfolios, the management of men. He didn't approach it with cruelty. He told himself that repeatedly, and most of the time he believed it. This wasn't cruelty. This was due diligence. This was a man who had been burned once badly doing the only rational thing, checking the temperature, before he put his hand in the fire again. He dressed the part carefully. Not poorly enough to be implausible. He wasn't playing a beggar, but plainly. Work trousers, a flannel shirt with the elbows worn soft, boots that had seen genuine use. He introduced himself simply as Nathan, leaving the Cole name unattached to any explanation of ranches or railroad shares. He was, for the purposes of these dinners, just a man. And one by one, each woman confirmed for him that just a man was not sufficient. Some left quickly like Clara had, gathering their things with the efficient precision of someone who had better places to be. Some made excuses: a sudden headache, an early morning, a sister who needed them. One woman, a merchant's daughter named Vivian, who had seemed genuinely warm for 3 full dates, looked at him across the table when he delivered the wallet line and said with a brightness that didn't quite reach her eyes, "Oh, how embarrassing for you," and excused herself to the powder room and never came back. That one had stung, he admitted. Not because of Vivian specifically, but because he had started to think for just a few weeks that maybe he'd been wrong, that maybe he was looking for something that didn't exist. Women number 22 through 25 he barely remembered as individuals. They blurred together into a single composite disappointment: the pause, the calculation, the graceful exit. By the time autumn rolled back around in 1882, Nathan Cole was 39 years old, owner of one of the largest cattle operations in the Montana Territory, and thoroughly quietly convinced that the version of love he was looking for did not exist among women who knew who he was. So he drove his wagon to a small town 40 miles southeast of Helena, a place called Millhaven. Barely a town at all, just a main street and a boarding house and a general store and a modest collection of people trying to build something out of nothing. And he told Hicks he'd be gone for a few weeks. "Any particular reason?" Hicks asked, which was approximately 5 words more than he usually offered. "I need to think," Nathan said. Hicks looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has worked for someone long enough to understand that some questions shouldn't be asked. "Fair enough," he said, and went back to the cattle. Nathan arrived in Millhaven on a Wednesday morning. He took a room at the Millhaven boarding house, a 2-story frame building run by a stout and efficient woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who charged 40 cents a night and included breakfast, which she described as filling, and which was in fact exactly that. He was seated for his first breakfast on Thursday morning: oatmeal, salt pork, black coffee, and a biscuit that had clearly been made by someone who knew what they were doing. When the boarding house door opened and a woman came in from the cold, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. Her cheeks red from the autumn air, her dark blonde hair escaping from its pins in 2 places. She said, "Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell," and set the basket on the counter without ceremony, and began sorting through the items inside with the focused efficiency of someone who had 17 other things to accomplish before noon. Mrs. Caldwell said, "Emma, that gentleman just arrived yesterday. Be sure he knows about the hot water situation." The woman Emma glanced over at Nathan, gave him a brisk evaluating look, the kind that assessed without lingering. "Hot water's only reliable before 7 in the morning," she said. "After that, you'll need to ask Mrs. Caldwell to heat it special, and she'll charge you 2 cents. "That's fine," Nathan said. "Breakfast is good here. Dinner's down the street at Hollis's if you want something hot in the evening. The biscuits at Hollis's aren't as good, but the stew's better than it looks." "Thank you." She nodded short businesslike and turned back to her basket. Nathan poured his coffee and watched her for a moment without appearing to. She moved the way people move when they've learned to be economical with their energy because there's simply too much to get done. No wasted motion, no performance. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She was in fact thoroughly and completely occupied with whatever was in that basket, and Nathan Cole and his breakfast were approximately the 40th thing on her list of things that required her attention. He found somewhat to his surprise that this was interesting. He learned the basic shape of her life over the next 3 days, through the natural accumulation of a small-town existence, the way you learn things about people when you're all sharing the same finite space. Emma Larson was 23 years old and had been in Millhaven for just over 2 years. She worked mornings at the boarding house, helping Mrs. Caldwell serving breakfast cleaning rooms, doing whatever needed doing, and spent her afternoons and most of her evenings at Hollis's Diner, where she waited tables. Somewhere in between, usually in the hours after 9 in the evening when normal people were sleeping, she took in sewing. Mending mostly. But also alterations for the wives of more prosperous men who lived a day's ride toward Helena, women who wanted dresses fitted properly but couldn't justify the trip. She was supporting her younger brother. Nathan learned that on Friday evening from Mrs. Caldwell herself, who delivered information with the unself-conscious thoroughness of a woman who had concluded that keeping secrets from her boarders was more trouble than it was worth. "Samuel's a bright boy," Mrs. Caldwell told him, while Nathan sat in the parlor with a cup of after-dinner tea. 16 years old and reads everything he can get his hands on. Poor thing can't walk, wagon accident 2 years back, took both parents and left him and Emma to manage on their own. Emma's been his entire world since then. Works herself half to pieces for that boy. Nathan thought about that for a longer moment than he showed. "She doesn't complain about it?" he asked. Mrs. Caldwell looked at him as though the question slightly confused her. "Emma, Lord, no. She's not the complaining type. She'd sooner cut off her own hand than ask someone to feel sorry for her." Nathan nodded and said nothing more. He saw Emma the next morning at breakfast. She was serving, moving between the 4 occupied tables, with the kind of practiced invisibility that good servers develop present when needed and absent when not. And on an impulse he didn't examine too carefully, he said when she refilled his coffee, "How long have you been in Millhaven?" She paused. "Not long. A single beat." "2 years," she said. "You like it here?" She set the coffee pot down on the edge of the table and gave him the same brisk, evaluating look she'd given him on his first morning. This time, it lasted a fraction longer. "It's a good town," she said. "People mind their own business and they work hard. Those 2 things together are harder to find than you'd think." "You're from?" "Sweden, originally. We came over when I was 11. She picked up the coffee pot. "You need anything else before the oatmeal comes?" "No," he said. "Thank you." She moved on to the next table. Nathan drank his coffee and thought about the fact that she had answered his questions with complete honesty and not a single word of invitation. She hadn't asked him anything back. She hadn't positioned herself to be interesting. She had given him a direct, factual answer and returned to her work. He had talked to 25 women in 2 years. Not one of them had spoken to him quite like that. The river was the circumstance that changed things. There was a stretch of the Millhaven Creek that ran behind the eastern edge of town. Not wide, not dramatic, just a steady cold current moving through a corridor of bare-limbed cottonwoods. Nathan walked there on Sunday mornings because the rest of the week, Millhaven was full of the noise of commerce and livestock and people conducting their lives at full volume, and Sunday mornings it fell quiet in a way that felt earned. He had been sitting on a flat rock above the waterline for perhaps 20 minutes when he heard footsteps on the path and looked up to find Emma Larson approaching with a book under her arm. She saw him, stopped. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "I'll find somewhere else," he said. "You don't have to." She sat down on a different rock, perhaps 8 feet from his, with the absence of self-consciousness that characterized everything she did. She opened her book. They sat in silence for a while. The creek moved. A bird Nathan couldn't name called twice from somewhere in the cottonwoods. "What are you reading?" he asked. She held up the cover without looking at him. Elements of Civil Engineering by J.W. Adams. He blinked. "That's your reading. It's Samuel's." She turned a page. "He's working through a problem about load distribution on bridge supports. He explained it to me last night, and I couldn't follow his reasoning past the 3rd step, so I'm reading the chapter he referenced. You're reading a civil engineering textbook, so you can have a conversation with your brother about bridge load distribution. I'm reading it so I can understand him when he talks to me," she said, with the simplicity of someone who had never considered that this might be unusual. "He spends a lot of hours on his own. The least I can do is meet him where he is." Nathan looked at the cover of the book, then at the woman holding it. "Do you have any interest in engineering yourself?" "Not particularly." She closed the book around her thumb to hold the page. "But I'm interested in Samuel. The engineering comes with him." There was a pause. "You have family here?" she asked. The question surprised him, not because it was intrusive, but because it was the first thing she'd asked him that wasn't strictly functional. "No," he said. "Not in Millhaven." "Somewhere else?" "A sister in Bozeman. We don't see each other often." Emma nodded. "And the rest?" "Gone. Both parents years back." He paused. "A broken engagement 3 years ago." He didn't know why he said that last part. He hadn't said it aloud to anyone in Millhaven, hadn't said it to anyone in longer than that. Emma's expression didn't shift into sympathy exactly. It shifted into something more like recognition. "That kind of loss is strange," she said. "It's not like losing someone to death. You lose who you thought the person was." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what it is." She opened her book again. They sat by the river for another 40 minutes. She read. He thought. Neither of them spoke again, and it was without question the most comfortable 40 minutes Nathan Cole had spent in another person's company in 3 years. Jim. He began to look for the river mornings. Not deliberately, or rather not in a way he admitted to himself. He simply found that Sunday was not the only day Emma Larson walked that creek path, and that she didn't seem to object to sharing the flat rocks with another person, provided that person didn't require her to perform pleasantness at him. Over the course of 2 weeks, they accumulated a collection of conversations that didn't follow any particular social script. She told him about Sweden, the fjords, the cold, the particular gray of the winter sky over the harbor town where she'd been born, with the unfussy clarity of someone who is describing something real rather than constructing a romantic narrative around it. The winters were harder than Montana, she said, but you knew where you stood. The cold didn't pretend. He told her about his parents. His father had been a cattleman who built the first 1,000 acres of what Nathan now owned, and had died believing Nathan would turn it into something worth having. He didn't live to see how it turned out, Nathan said. I'm not sure how he would have felt about it. How do you feel about it? Emma asked. It was a simple question, direct. Nathan thought about it for a real moment before answering. Responsible, he said finally. Like it matters that I do it right. Beyond that, he paused. I'm not sure. Emma looked at him with the same evaluating quality she'd turned on him that first morning, but softer now and longer. That's an honest answer, she said. Most people want a better one. Most people want an answer that makes them comfortable, she said. That's different. He found himself wanting to ask her something specific, something that mattered, and stopping himself each time, because the asking would require him to give something back in return. He wasn't ready to give anything back. Not yet. Not until he knew. The dinner test. He had been in Millhaven for 19 days when he arranged it. He asked Emma on a Tuesday. Hollis's diner Friday evening. Just dinner. He kept his voice casual, matter-of-fact. Nothing that could be construed as formal or weighted. She looked at him for a moment with the particular steadiness he had come to recognize as her thinking expression. "I finish at 6, she said. 6 works." "All right," she said, and went back to setting the table she was clearing. He spent the 3 days between Tuesday and Friday in a state he hadn't experienced in quite this form before. It wasn't anticipation exactly. It wasn't dread. It was something closer to the feeling he got before a large cattle auction. The knowledge that the outcome mattered, and that he couldn't fully control it, and that he had to proceed anyway. Friday arrived. Emma came to Hollis's straight from her shift, still in her work dress, her hair redone in a neater version of the usual pins-escaping arrangement. She sat down across from him and picked up the menu, a single laminated card, and studied it with the concentration she brought to everything. "The beef stew is reliable," she said. "Good enough for me." She ordered the stew. He ordered the same. The food came. They talked about Samuel's latest engineering problem, which involved something to do with the tensile strength of iron versus wood in cold weather, and about whether the territorial government was ever going to fund a proper road between Millhaven and the Helena Junction, and about a letter Emma had received that week from a woman in Sweden who had been her mother's closest friend. "She asks me every year if we're coming back," Emma said. "Every year I write the same letter. There's nothing to come back to. We're here now. This is where we build." "You never miss it." "I miss what it was," she said. "Before, when my parents were alive. But that's not really missing Sweden. That's missing them." She said it plainly, the way she said most things. Without ornament. Without the slight theatrical weight people sometimes put on grief, to signal that you should respond to it in a particular way. He responded honestly. "I understand that distinction," he said. She looked at him. "I thought you might." They ate in something that was not quite silence. There was the noise of the diner around them. Other tables, the kitchen, but felt private despite it. When the waiter came back for dessert, Nathan set his fork down and reached into his coat pocket. He let his hand search, patted the other pocket. The vest. He let the pause lengthen. "Emma?" His voice was level, careful. "I'm sorry. My wallet, I don't seem to have it." He watched her face. She didn't shift into calculation. She didn't gather herself toward the door. She didn't rearrange her expression into the particular blend of disappointment and withdrawal that he had watched move across 25 other faces. She looked at him for a moment with those direct, steady eyes. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron, she'd worn her work apron, without apparently giving it a second thought, and untied a small cloth pouch. She set it on the table. He could hear the soft sound of coins inside it. She didn't make a production of it. She didn't look at him with pointed patience or theatrical generosity. She didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, "You'll pay next time. Today we simply finished dinner." The noise of the diner continued around them. Nathan did not move. He had played this scene 25 times. He knew every beat of it, the pause, the calculation, the exit. He knew the particular quality of the silence that preceded a woman deciding to leave. This was not that silence. This was something he had no script for. He looked at the cloth pouch. He looked at Emma Larson, who had picked her fork back up and was continuing her stew with the composure of someone who had done nothing remarkable whatsoever. "Emma," he started. "It's tips," she said without looking up. "From this week. It's not charity. It's just dinner." She met his eyes briefly. "Don't make it something it isn't." He sat very still. 25 women. 3 years. 1 sentence. "We simply finished dinner." He reached up slowly with the kind of care a man takes when he's handling something he's afraid of breaking and pushed the cloth pouch back across the table toward her. "Emma," he said, "I have to tell you something." She set her fork down, looked at him properly. "The wallet isn't missing." He held the pause for exactly 1 second. "I tested you," he said. "I've been testing." He stopped. Started again. "I needed to know if you'd leave." The diner noise continued. A chair scraped somewhere behind them. A man laughed at another table. Emma Larson's expression didn't collapse into anger. It moved through something more complicated, a flicker of confusion, then understanding, then something quiet and assessing, settling behind her eyes. She looked at him for a long time. "How many times have you done this?" she asked. He didn't lie. He had told himself he wouldn't lie, not about this, not to her. 25, he said. She absorbed this. And they all left. Everyone. Another silence. She looked at the cloth pouch sitting between them on the table. "Nathan." Her voice was controlled. Not cold. She wasn't a cold woman, he had already come to understand that, but measured in the way of someone choosing their words from a place of actual thought rather than reaction. "I want you to understand something. I didn't put that money on the table because you deserve it. I put it on the table because leaving a man sitting alone in a diner without dinner isn't something I'm willing to do to another person. That's about me, not you." He said nothing. "You've been testing women for 3 years," she continued, "dressing up a wound as an experiment, and that's—" She paused. "That's a sad thing to do, Nathan. It really is." He felt the accuracy of it like a hand pressing on a bruise. "I know," he said. "Do you?" He looked at her, at this woman, who had just put the coins she'd earned on her feet all week onto a table for a man she barely knew. And then when that man told her the truth, had sat quietly and said, "That's a sad thing to do." Not with cruelty, not with the contempt he'd braced for, but with the directness of someone who believed that a true thing was worth saying regardless of whether the other person wanted to hear it. "I'm beginning to," he said. Emma looked at him for one more long moment. Then she picked up her fork. "Finish your dinner," she said. He stared at her. "You're not going to leave." She met his eyes. "No, I'm going to finish my stew, which is in fact quite good tonight. And then I'm going to go home and help Samuel with his bridge problem." She paused. "But Nathan—" "Yes. If there's a 27th test—" She held his gaze without flinching. "There won't be a 27th dinner." He nodded. "There won't be a 27th test," he said. And for the first time in 3 years, when he said something like that, he meant it completely. The walk home from Hollis's that night took Nathan 40 minutes longer than usual. He didn't go directly back to the boarding house. He walked the long way past the general store and the small church at the end of Main Street and the livery stable where his horse shifted in the dark as he passed. He walked until the cold started coming through his coat and his breath made small clouds in the autumn air. He was thinking about Margaret, not with longing that had been gone for so long he could barely locate where it had been, but thinking about the logic of it, the mechanism. Margaret had left because she found someone richer. He had built 3 years of testing around that single truth as though it were a universal law. All women have a number, and when they find someone with a higher one, they go. 25 women had confirmed it. One woman had picked up a cloth pouch full of tips and set it on a table. He stood in front of the boarding house for a moment. "That's about me, not you." She had put money on the table for her own reasons, her own character, her own sense of what she was willing to be in the world. It had nothing to do with whether he deserved it. Nathan Cole went inside, climbed the stairs to his room, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a long time without lighting the lamp. He thought about 25 women and what he had done to all of them, dressed up as a poor man, performed vulnerability he wasn't actually experiencing, turned their responses into data points in a study whose conclusion he had already decided before he began. He thought about Emma Larson saying, "That's a sad thing to do." He thought she was right. He blew out a long breath into the dark. He thought, what happens now? He didn't have an answer, but for the first time in 3 years, not having an answer didn't feel like a verdict. It felt like a beginning. The morning after the dinner, Nathan came downstairs earlier than usual. Emma was already there. She was moving through the boarding house with her usual economy of motion, straightening chair and cups left from the night before, exchanging a few words with Mrs. Caldwell over something to do with the laundry schedule. She didn't look up when Nathan came in. Not right away. And when she did, her expression was the same as it had always been, direct, unperformed, giving him nothing he hadn't earned. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. That was all. He sat down. She brought him coffee without being asked, because she brought everyone coffee without being asked, and then she went back to her work. And Nathan sat with his cup and realized with a clarity that was almost physical that the fact that she was treating him exactly the same as yesterday, no warmer, no cooler, no visible trace of the conversation that had turned his understanding of himself inside out, was the most remarkable thing that had happened to him in 3 years. She wasn't punishing him. She wasn't rewarding him. She was simply continuing. He drank his coffee and thought about what it meant to be simply continued with. He found her at the river that Sunday, as he had begun to expect he would. She was already on her rock when he arrived, the civil engineering textbook open across her knees, but she wasn't reading it. She was looking at the water with the particular stillness of someone working through a problem that doesn't live in any book. He sat down on his rock without ceremony. "Did you finish Samuel's bridge problem?" he asked. "He finished it," she said. "I watched." "Understand it," she considered. Enough to follow the logic, not enough to replicate it. She glanced over at him. "He's been at that table since 6 this morning. He'll be there when I get back." "What does he use for the calculations?" "Whatever paper he can get. I bring him ledger paper from the general store when I can afford the extra. He fills it front and back and then starts over on the margins." A brief pause. "He has better spatial reasoning than anyone I've ever met. He sees things in 3 dimensions in his head. He told me once that when he imagines a bridge, he can walk across it in his mind and feel which boards flex under his weight." Nathan set his elbows on his knees and looked at the water. "Has he had any formal instruction?" "A school in Helena accepted him by letter when he was 14, Emma said. "Before the accident, we were going to move." She stopped, started again. "We didn't move." The creek moved. A branch shifted somewhere above them in the wind. "He needs drafting materials," Nathan said. "Not as an offer, as an observation." Emma heard the difference. "He manages." "I'm sure he does. I'm saying he needs them." She looked at him. Not defensively, she wasn't a defensive woman, but with the careful steadiness of someone who has learned to identify the specific shape of charity before it arrives. "Nathan, it's not—" "I know what it is," she said. Not harshly, just clearly. "And I'm telling you, Samuel and I don't take things from people. We never have, not since we've been on our own." "That's a principle," he said. "It's more than a principle." She closed the engineering book. "It's the only thing I've been able to guarantee him, that whatever we have we built, that nobody owns a piece of us." She held his gaze without wavering. "Can you understand that—" He could. More than that, he respected it in a way he hadn't respected a person's position on something in a very long time. Because it wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't pride in the pejorative sense. It was a woman who had decided under circumstances that would have leveled most people that integrity was the one asset she could reliably protect, and she was protecting it with everything she had. "I understand it," he said. "Good. But I want you to know—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The offer stands, not as charity, just as a fact." Emma looked at him for a long moment. "You're a stubborn man," she said. "I've been told." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The expression of a person who is suppressing amusement against their better judgment. "All right," she said. She opened the book again. "Tell me something then, since you want to be useful." "What?" "Tell me about cattle ranching. Samuel keeps asking me questions about large-scale land management, and I have absolutely nothing to tell him." Nathan blinked. Then he laughed. It came out without warning, without the managed quality that his laughter had taken on over the past few years. Genuine, a little rough from disuse, surprising him as much as it surprised her. Emma looked at him with her evaluating expression. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He settled himself. "All right. Cattle ranching. Where do you want to start?" "Wherever it makes sense to start." "That's a long conversation." "I have time," she said. "Samuel doesn't need me back until noon." So Nathan Cole, who had not talked openly about his land and his cattle, and the work that consumed him to anyone in longer than he could clearly remember, began to talk. He talked for an hour and a half. He talked about the movement of cattle through the seasons, the way a herd needs to be rotated across grazing land to prevent the grass from being stripped bare. He talked about reading weather the way a man who's spent enough years watching a Montana sky can feel a blizzard coming 3 days before it arrives, in the particular quality of the air and the behavior of the cattle themselves, who grew restless and difficult and started moving in the direction the wind would drive the storm from. He talked about the economics of it, the rail contracts that made the difference between a profitable season and a ruinous one, the way prices in Chicago could collapse a rancher's entire year before he'd shipped a single head. Emma listened. She listened the way she did everything completely without performance, asking questions at the exact moments when a question was useful, and staying quiet at the moments when it wasn't. She asked about the relationship between grazing patterns and soil health. She asked whether the railroad companies had set pricing structures or whether they were negotiated. She asked at one point a question about bridge load distribution that made Nathan realize she had absorbed considerably more of that engineering textbook than she'd admitted. By the time the hour was up, Nathan was aware of something that he hadn't been when he sat down. He was enjoying himself. Not in the managed, careful way he'd enjoyed conversations over the past 3 years, monitoring the other person for calculation, tracking the temperature of the exchange, keeping one hand always on the exit. Just genuinely, unguardedly enjoying himself. Talking about something he knew well to someone who was listening because she actually wanted to understand. It was such a simple thing. He had forgotten it was possible. The week that followed moved differently than the weeks before it. Nathan began making himself useful around the boarding house in small ways, fixing a hinge on the parlor door that had been sticking since before he arrived, reattaching a loose fence rail in the yard. Mrs. Caldwell accepted these contributions with the pragmatic gratitude of a woman who had a long list of things that needed doing and limited means to do them, and didn't ask questions about why a boarding house guest was volunteering his time. He started eating dinner at Hollis's in the evenings, partly because the stew was, as Emma had correctly assessed, better than it looked, and partly because Emma's evening shift ended at 8, and she often sat for a few minutes at the counter before walking home. And they had fallen into the habit of those few minutes without either of them naming it as a habit. They talked about ordinary things. The territorial governor's latest proclamation about road taxation. A fire at a homestead 2 miles east of town that the community had organized to help rebuild. A book Emma was reading, an actual novel this time, not Samuel's engineering texts, that she described as overwrought but compelling, which I suppose is its own kind of achievement. He learned her rhythms. He learned that she was sharpest in the mornings and softer in the evenings when the 16-hour days had worn down some of the brisk efficiency and left something quieter underneath. He learned that she never complained about being tired, but occasionally went very still for a moment, mid-sentence, mid-movement, in a way that meant she was conserving herself. He learned that she laughed rarely but genuinely, and that when she did, it changed her whole face. He was keeping track of these things without meaning to. That was new. He had kept track of things about women before during the testing period, but it had been the tracking of an investigator, systematic and detached. This was something else. This was the tracking of a man who is paying attention because he cannot help it. Because the thing in front of him is interesting in a way he didn't anticipate and doesn't entirely understand, and his mind keeps returning to it the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. He told himself it was too soon to call it anything. He had not yet told her who he was. That fact lived in the back of every conversation, like a stone at the bottom of a clear river, invisible unless you looked directly at it, but altering the shape of everything that flowed above it. On a Thursday afternoon, nearly 4 weeks into his time in Millhaven, Emma asked him if he wanted to meet Samuel. She asked it in the same direct, undecorated way she asked most things, standing at the boarding house counter, sorting through a stack of newly delivered sewing, not looking at him. "He asked about you," she added. "He heard me mention cattle rotation, and he wants to know about the engineering of irrigation systems for large grazing operations." She did look up then, briefly. "He's not shy, but he doesn't ask to meet people, so?" "I'd like that," Nathan said. They walked to the small house Emma rented on the eastern edge of town. 2 rooms Nathan saw when she opened the door, but arranged with the particular neatness of a person who has made a decision to treat what they have with care. Every surface was clean. Every item had a place. And at the table near the single window sat Samuel Larson. He was 16, which Nathan knew, but he looked simultaneously younger and older. A boy's face still unformed at the jaw and temple, but with eyes that had the settled, focused quality of someone who has spent considerable time inside a very serious interior life. His legs were covered with a blanket. On the table in front of him was a spread of papers covered in pencil drawings, not just calculations Nathan saw as he got closer, but actual architectural renderings. Bridges. 3 of them in varying configurations, all drawn with a precision that would not have embarrassed a professional engineer. "Mr. Cole," Samuel said. No preamble. He pushed the drawings toward the center of the table. "Emma says you manage a large cattle operation. I've been working on a problem about irrigation channel design for high-gradient terrain. If you're actually interested in talking about it, I'd like your input on the practical requirements." Nathan pulled out a chair and sat down. "Show me what you have," he said. They talked for 3 hours. Emma brought them coffee and then retreated to her sewing with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has correctly predicted that 2 people would get along and is gracious enough not to make a spectacle of it. Samuel was extraordinary. Nathan had met educated men engineers, surveyors, architects who had studied at proper institutions back east. He had sat across negotiating tables from men who understood structures and systems at a level far beyond his own working knowledge. Samuel Larson had none of their credentials, and at least as much of their intelligence, perhaps more, because his was unmediated by convention. He hadn't learned to think inside someone else's framework. He had built his own. He showed Nathan the bridge drawings and explained his reasoning on load distribution, with a clarity that made Nathan, who was not a stupid man, work to keep up. He talked about the relationship between material flexibility and structural integrity in terms of temperature variance, which was, he explained, a significant problem in Montana, specifically because the swing between summer heat and winter cold was severe enough to affect the behavior of metal components in ways that most Eastern engineers hadn't accounted for. "Most of the bridge failures I've read about in the territory," Samuel said, "weren't failures of design. They were failures of adaptation. Someone applied a design that worked in Ohio and didn't account for what Montana does to iron in February." "You've read about the territorial bridge failures. I've read everything I can get." He said it without embarrassment. "The Helena newspaper runs engineering reports sometimes. I write letters to the territorial surveyor's office. They've started sending me their preliminary assessments." Nathan looked at him. "They send reports to a 16-year-old in Millhaven. They send reports to S. Larson, civil engineering consultant," Samuel said with a completely straight face. "They don't know I'm 16. They know I find their errors before they do." Nathan stared at him for a moment. Then he laughed the same unguarded laugh that Emma had produced out of him by the river genuine and slightly startled. From across the room, Emma looked up from her sewing. She caught Nathan's eye for a fraction of a second. Something passed between them that was not quite a smile, and not quite an acknowledgement, and was entirely real. Nathan looked back at Samuel's drawings. "The irrigation problem," he said. "Walk me through your current design." Samuel pulled the relevant paper toward him and began. He walked back to the boarding house in the dark, which by now had become cold enough that his breath made clouds and the mud at the edge of the road had frozen into hard ridges. He walked with his hands in his pockets and his thoughts moving faster than his feet. Samuel Larson was going to build something. Nathan didn't mean that sentimentally. He meant it as a practical assessment, the same way he assessed a piece of land or a head of cattle based on what he could observe. The boy had a mind that was going to produce things. Real things. Things that would stand in the world and carry weight and matter. The only question was whether the world was going to give him the materials to do it with. He thought about the paper covered in drawings. Front and back, Emma had said. Then starting over in the margins. He thought about the drafting tools Samuel didn't have. The textbooks beyond what Emma could carry home from the general store. The formal instruction that had been 4 months away when a wagon wheel broke on a mountain road and took everything. He thought about Emma sitting across the room with her sewing, listening to them talk, her face doing the thing it did when Samuel explained something she didn't fully understand, that small focused furrow of concentration that meant she was working at it. He thought about the fact that he had more money than he could meaningfully spend and was currently living in a 40-cent-a-night room and pretending to be a ranch hand. And he thought for the first time that the deception he had designed to protect himself might be in the process of causing harm to someone who had never done anything to deserve it. He pushed that thought aside. He wasn't ready to address it yet. He told himself he just needed more time. The following week, Emma came to breakfast with a crease between her eyebrows that wasn't there on an ordinary morning. Nathan noticed it immediately. He had become without meaning to attune to the small variations in her expression in the way you become attuned to the small variations in weather when your livelihood depends on reading the sky correctly. He waited until the other boarders had finished and left before he said, "What happened?" She looked at him. "Nothing I can't manage," she said. Standard Emma Larson answer. He had learned to hear through it. "Emma." A pause. She set down the coffee pot. "The woman who orders most of my sewing work, Mrs. Hale, she lives near the Helena Junction. She sent word that she won't need me through the winter season. Her daughter is coming to stay, and apparently brought her own seamstress from back east." A controlled breath. "It's a third of my monthly income." He held his expression neutral. "Can you replace it?" "I'm going to try. I'll go to the 2 other households I know of in the area. It may take time." She picked up the coffee pot again. "It's fine." "Emma." "It's fine, Nathan." Her voice was still level, but there was something underneath it, not quite fear, but its adjacent cousin. The particular tension of a person who runs a very precise operation and has just had a support beam removed. "I've managed worse." He knew she had. He also knew, with a certainty that sat in his chest like a weight, that he was sitting 3 feet away from her, with the financial resources to resolve this problem in about 4 minutes, and he was not in a position to say so, because she thought he was a ranch hand, and he thought he was a ranch hand because he had made himself one. "Let me know if there's anything I can do," he said. It was the most useless sentence he had spoken in months. She gave him a brief distracted nod and moved on to the next table. He made a decision that afternoon. He rode to the telegraph office. The nearest one was 7 miles out at a crossroads station called Porter's Junction, and sent a wire to Hicks at the ranch. "Send me a catalog from the Helena Engineering Supply House. Also inquire about correspondence courses in civil and structural engineering available to students not attending institution in person. Send reply to Millhaven General Delivery." Hicks's reply came 2 days later, terse as always. Catalog arriving Thursday. 3 correspondence programs identified. Details enclosed. Nathan collected the package at the general store on Thursday, took it back to his room, and spent the evening going through it with the same methodical focus he brought to a cattle contract. He was not going to offer Emma money. He understood now with a clarity that had taken him several weeks to arrive at that offering. Emma Larson money was not an act of generosity. It was an act that didn't understand her. She had told him plainly that what she and Samuel had built, however modest, however hard, was theirs. Buying into it would be stepping on something she'd built with her own hands and calling it a gift. But Samuel's talent was real. Samuel's talent was by any reasonable measure exactly the kind of talent that deserved investment. Not charity. Investment. There was a difference. He was going to have to explain that difference. And to explain it, going to have to say things he hadn't said to anyone in Millhaven. Not yet. Not until he'd finished one conversation first. He found Emma at the river on Sunday, the 5th Sunday in a row, though neither of them had made it explicit that this was now something they did. She looked tired. The week had been long, he knew, and the sewing client situation hadn't resolved itself. But she had the engineering textbook again, which meant she'd been with Samuel the night before, which meant she'd worked her regular shift, and then gone home, and sat with her brother until he didn't need her anymore. He sat down. Let a moment pass. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." If Samuel had the chance for formal engineering education, a real program, one that could lead somewhere actual, what would you want for him? She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the water. "I want him to have everything," she said. "Every tool, every book, every qualified man willing to teach him what they know. I want him to build his bridges and have the world use them." A pause. "That's what I want." "And what would you accept?" She looked at him sharply. "That's a different question." "Yes," he said. "It is." The wind moved through the cottonwoods above them. She turned back to the water. "I would accept anything that he earned," she said quietly. "That's the difference. If something came to him because someone recognized his work, recognized what he's actually done, the problems he's actually solved, I wouldn't refuse that. That's not charity. That's the world working the way it should." Nathan nodded. He filed that away. "Emma," he said, "there's something I need to tell you." She turned to look at him. And in that moment, with the creek running beneath them and the cold coming through both their coats and her eyes steady on his, with the complete directness that was the most characteristic thing about her, Nathan Cole almost said it. He opened his mouth, and from the path behind them came the sound of boots on frozen ground moving fast and a voice he had not heard in 3 years. "Nathan." It was a woman's voice. He turned. Margaret Ashford was standing on the creek path in a traveling coat that had cost more than Emma earned in a month, her dark hair arranged in the precise constructed way he remembered her expression, moving through surprise and calculation so quickly that only someone who knew her well would catch the sequence. Her eyes went from Nathan to Emma, and something shifted in her face that Nathan did not like at all. "I've been looking everywhere for you," Margaret said. Her voice had the warmth of a woman who has decided very recently to be warm. "They told me in Helena you'd come east. I never imagined." She looked around with a particular quality of looking that managed to take in and dismiss everything simultaneously. "Here." Nathan stood up from his rock. His heart was hitting his chest wall with the kind of force that had nothing to do with effort. He had not planned for this. In all his careful management of the past 3 years, in all his methodical structuring of tests and exits, he had never planned for Margaret Ashford to walk down a creek path in Millhaven and find him sitting beside Emma Larson with the most important sentence of the past decade half-formed on his tongue. Emma had risen too. She was standing a few feet back, her book at her side, her expression professionally neutral, reading the situation without showing that she was reading it. "Margaret," Nathan said. His voice was controlled. "What are you doing in Millhaven?" "Looking for you," she said again. She smiled the smile he remembered, the one she deployed with surgical accuracy. "I heard the most alarming rumors in Helena. People saying you'd gone east, that you'd been seen in ordinary clothes, that—" She paused, and her eyes moved to his flannel shirt, his work trousers, his boots. Something moved across her face. "The rumors appear to be true. I'm on a working trip," Nathan said. "Of course." She looked at Emma again. Direct this time, with an assessment that made Emma straighten almost imperceptibly. "I don't believe we've met." Emma looked at her with the same expression she turned on everyone evaluating honest, giving nothing away. "Emma Larson." "Margaret Ashford." She let the name sit as though it should mean something. "An old friend of Nathan's. A very old friend." Nathan watched Emma's face. Emma looked at Margaret Ashford's traveling coat, at her constructed hair, at the particular way she was standing positioned. Nathan saw through the sudden sharp lens of this moment to be looked at. Then Emma looked at Nathan. Her expression was unreadable. Not closed, Emma's face was never closed, but carefully, intentionally still. "I'll let you catch up," Emma said. Her voice was even. She picked up the engineering textbook, tucked it under her arm, and nodded briefly to Nathan, not to Margaret, and walked up the path toward town without looking back. Nathan watched her go. He felt the moment close around him like a hand. "She seems practical," Margaret said from behind him. "Is she local?" He turned. Margaret was looking at him with the warmth still deployed, but underneath it, underneath the warmth and the traveling coat and the 3 years of absence, was the expression of a woman who has made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion she intends to act on. And Nathan, looking at her, felt something clarify in him with the cold simplicity of a fact. He knew why she was here. She had heard rumors, not that he'd gone east, not that he'd been seen in ordinary clothes, but the only rumor that would bring Margaret Ashford 40 miles from Helena to a crossroads town in autumn. Someone had told her the rumors about Nathan's fortune. Not that he'd lost it, that it had grown. She wasn't here because she was alarmed about him. She was here because she'd recalculated. He stood on the frozen bank of Millhaven Creek in his flannel shirt and his worn boots, and looked at the woman who had sent back his sapphire ring in a small envelope, and felt nothing at all. No anger. No residue of the old hurt. No pull of the old wanting. Just clarity. And beneath the clarity, the beginning of something cold and specific. The question was no longer whether Margaret Ashford would behave exactly the way he'd always known she would. The question was what he was going to do about the woman who had just walked up the path without looking back. The woman to whom he had not yet, in 25 days, said a single entirely true thing about himself. And whether after today she would give him the chance. Nathan did not go after Emma. Not immediately. He stood on the creek bank and let Margaret talk because Margaret had always needed to talk first to establish the shape of whatever scene she'd decided she was performing in, and he listened with the particular quality of attention he'd developed over the past month in Millhaven. The kind that watches the gap between what someone is saying and what they mean. She talked about Helena, about mutual acquaintances, about a dinner party at the governor's residence where someone had mentioned Nathan's name, and she had realized, she said, pressing her gloved hand briefly to her collarbone, how much time had passed and how little she had done with it. "I've thought about you," she said. "More than you probably know." "Have you?" Nathan said. It wasn't a question. She heard the flatness of it and recalibrated with the speed of someone accustomed to recalibrating. "I made a mistake," she said. Directly. Margaret, when she decided to be direct, could be very direct. "I was young, and I was foolish, and Clifford Hale was—" She paused, selecting. "A disappointment, in every sense." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" "No," he said. "Not particularly." She looked at him with something genuine moving behind the constructed warmth, surprise maybe. He had never spoken to her quite that flatly before. In the years they were together, he had been careful with her, considerate. He had chosen his words the way he now chose not to. "Nathan. Margaret." He kept his voice even. "Why are you in Millhaven?" "A beat. I told you, I was worried." "No," he said. "That's not why." She held his gaze for a moment. Then something shifted. Not defeat. Margaret didn't do defeat, but a kind of reset. A decision to try a different approach. "You've changed," she said. 3 years does that. The clothes." She gestured briefly at his flannel shirt. "The boarding house. People are saying—" "What are people saying?" Another pause. Shorter. "That you've had reversals. Financial ones." There it was. Nathan looked at her and felt the last thin thread of whatever complicated residue had remained from what they were to each other dissolve cleanly away. She had come to check. She had come to assess whether the rumors of his failure were true, or whether the counter-rumors, the ones about the expanded railroad contracts, the new grazing land. The growing fortune were more reliable, and to position herself accordingly. He had spent 3 years testing 25 women for exactly this quality. He had never once thought to apply the woman who had made it necessary. "I'm fine, Margaret," he said. "The business is fine. You don't need to concern yourself." Something moved through her face, relief immediately managed. "I'm glad. You should go back to Helena," he said. "There's nothing here for you." She opened her mouth. "I mean that kindly," he added. Which was true. He bore her no malice. He simply felt nothing, and the nothing was clean and final and complete. "I genuinely wish you well, but whatever you came here hoping to find, it isn't here." He walked past her up the creek path toward town, and he didn't look back. Emma wasn't at the boarding house when he returned. Mrs. Caldwell told him she'd stopped in briefly to drop off the morning's clean linens and then headed to Hollis's for her afternoon shift. Her face as she passed through Mrs. Caldwell, added with the particular sensitivity of a woman who had been observing human behavior in a boarding house for 20 years, had been what she described as closed up tight. Nathan changed his shirt because Margaret had seen this one and walked to Hollis's. Emma was working the room with her usual efficiency when he came in. She looked at him once, a brief level look, and then returned her attention to the table she was serving. He sat at the counter and waited. When she passed close enough, he said quietly, "She's gone." Emma set a coffee cup down without breaking stride. "That's not my business." "I'd like to explain." "Nathan." She stopped, looked at him directly. There was no accusation in her face, which in some ways was harder to manage than accusation. Just the careful stillness that meant she was holding something back. "You don't owe me an explanation. She's an old friend. People have old friends." "She's my former fiancée," he said. Emma's expression didn't change dramatically. A small shift around the eyes. A tightening at the corner of her mouth that she controlled quickly. "I see," she said. "I wanted you to know that before you heard it some other way." She held his gaze for a moment. "Why did it end?" "She found someone wealthier." The words sat on the counter between them. Emma looked at them, not at him for just a second, but at the shape of the sentence, and then looked back up. "And she came back because—" "She heard I was doing well," he said, "and wanted to assess whether that was true." Emma was quiet for a count of 3. Then she said with a precision that was almost surgical, "So she tested you." He hadn't thought of it that way. The irony of it arrived in his chest like a cold fist. "Yes," he said. "I suppose she did." Emma looked at him for a long moment. Not with pity, she wasn't a pitying woman, but with the expression of someone who has just understood something they hadn't fully understood before. "I have 4 more tables," she said, "but I'll be at the counter at 8 if you want to talk." He nodded. She moved away. He ordered coffee and waited and thought about the fact that a woman who had every reason to make this about herself had made it instead about giving him a specific time and a clear invitation. At 8 o'clock, the diner thinned out, and Emma sat down at the counter across from him with a cup of her own coffee and the expression of someone who has decided to be honest regardless of the cost. "Tell me about her," she said. So he did. He told Emma about Margaret with the same directness Emma brought to everything. No softening, no self-pity, no construction of himself as a noble wounded figure. He told her about the engagement and the ring he'd had made in San Francisco, and the 4 sentences the maid had delivered. He told her about the 14 months of working himself to exhaustion, and the winter the loneliness settled in and didn't leave. He told her about the tests. Not just the fact of them, she already knew that, but the reasoning behind them, the specific shape of the wound. The way Margaret's departure hadn't just broken something personal, but had broken something structural, his ability to believe that what he saw in a person was actually there. Emma listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 25 women, she said. "And you told yourself that was due diligence." "Yes." "And now," he looked at his coffee. Now I think it was a way of staying in control of something that had already hurt me. If I administered the test and they failed it, I was right, and I was protected. If they failed it, he stopped. If they passed it, I think I would have found a reason not to trust the result. Emma tilted her head slightly. You think so? I kept raising the stakes, he said. 25 is not due diligence. 25 is a man who doesn't actually want to find what he says he's looking for. She looked at him steadily. And what happened on the 26th? The 26th didn't follow the script, he said. Something moved in Emma's expression. Not softness exactly. Recognition. You still haven't told me, she said, what you actually do. You came to Millhaven as what? A traveler, a man between things. I've never asked, and you've never offered. She paused. I'd like to know. He had known this was coming. He had known it was coming for 2 weeks, and had told himself each day that tomorrow was the right moment, that he needed more time, that the foundation wasn't solid enough yet, that she needed to know him first before she knew what he owned. He had told himself all of those things, and every one of them had been true, and none of them had been the actual reason. The actual reason was simpler and less flattering. He was afraid, not of her leaving. He was no longer afraid of that in the way he'd been afraid of it before Emma set coins on a table. He was afraid of something else. He was afraid that when the full shape of what he owned became visible, it would change the texture of everything between them. Not because she would become like Margaret, calculating and repositioning. Emma wasn't capable of that, but because knowledge changes things. Because once she knew he was Nathan Cole of the Cole Cattle Empire, she would never again be entirely certain that the friendship, the river mornings, the conversations about bridge load distribution had happened organically. She might spend the rest of their acquaintance wondering which parts of him were real and which parts were the performance of a man who had something to offer. He was afraid of giving her a reason to doubt the one thing between them that had been from the beginning genuinely real. But he had also sat on the creek bank an hour ago and thought about all the things he hadn't said, and felt the weight of them pressing against the honesty she deserved. Emma, he said, I need to tell you something. Something I should have said 3 weeks ago. She set her coffee cup down. She looked at him with those direct, steady eyes. The ranch I mentioned, he said. It's not a working arrangement I have with someone else's operation. A breath. It's mine. 42,000 acres outside Helena. 1,200 head of Hereford cattle. Railroad investments. He held her gaze. I'm not a ranch hand passing through. I'm the man who owns the ranch. The diner noise continued around them, a man laughing at a corner table. The kitchen sounds the scrape of a chair. Emma did not move. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read, and Emma's expressions were usually readable. He had learned to read them. That was part of what these weeks had built. But this one was layered in a way that the others hadn't been. How large did you say? She asked. Her voice was perfectly level. 42,000 acres. And the railroad shares? Substantial, yes. Another silence. Nathan. Her voice had shifted, not colder, but more careful. The way a person's voice shifts when they are doing a calculation they don't particularly want to do. Every conversation we've had, every morning at the river, the questions about my work, about Samuel. She stopped. All real, he said. Everything I said was real. But you weren't. I was. The person you talked to, that was me. The person I talked to, she said. And now there was something underneath the levelness, something taut and compressed. Was a man I believed had no particular power over my situation. A man passing through. That's who I talked to. That's who I... She stopped again. He waited. You knew things about me, she said quietly. About what I earn. About Samuel. About the sewing client I lost. You sat across from me and knew things that could... She exhaled. You had every advantage in every conversation we had, and I didn't know it. I wasn't using it against you. You were using it, she said. Even if that wasn't how you meant it. Information is its own kind of power, Nathan. Knowing more about someone than they know about you is a form of... She paused, choosing carefully. Leverage. Even when you don't intend it as leverage. He felt the accuracy of this, the same way he'd felt the accuracy of that's a sad thing to do, like a clean case and deserved. You're right, he said. I know I'm right. She picked up her coffee cup, set it down without drinking. How long were you planning to tell me? I was trying to find the right moment. There is no right moment for something like this. There's just the moment you choose. She met his eyes. You kept choosing not to. He had no defense for that. He offered none. Emma, I need to think, she said. She stood up from the counter stool. Her voice was controlled, but her hands when she reached for her apron ties were not entirely steady. I'm not, she stopped, started again. I'm not angry in the way you might expect. I don't think you're a bad man. I think you're a man who's been afraid for a very long time and made some decisions out of that fear that he's now having to live with. She looked at him directly. But I need to think about what this means. About what I said to you and what I thought I was saying it to. What you said was real, he said. The person you said it to was real. Maybe, she said. But right now, I don't know how to separate the real from the rest of it. She picked up her cloth. Good night, Nathan. She walked back into the kitchen. He sat at the counter for a long time, without moving. Margaret Ashford did not, as it turned out, go back to Helena the next morning. She took a room at the only hotel Millhaven had, a modest frame building on Main Street that offered considerably less comfort than she was accustomed to. And this fact reached Nathan through Mrs. Caldwell, who received information the way a telegraph office receives wires constantly and from all directions. He didn't go to see her. He spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended, uncomfortable uncertainty that was entirely new to him. He had spent 3 years being the one in control of the variables. He had designed the test, administered the test, evaluated the results. He had always known walking into any situation with any woman exactly what outcome he was prepared for. He was not prepared for this outcome. Emma's shifts continued. He saw her at the boarding house in the mornings. She served his coffee. She was efficient and not unkind. She answered direct questions with direct answers. But the quality of the silence between them had changed. The comfortable lived-in silence of the river mornings had been replaced by something more careful, more considered. The silence of two people who are both thinking about the same thing and neither is ready to say it yet. He respected it. It nearly killed him, but he respected it. On the 3rd day after his confession, Nathan walked into Hollis's for his evening meal and found Margaret already there. She was at a table near the window in her traveling coat, because she had apparently brought only one, and she was speaking to 2 women Nathan recognized as the wives of Millhaven's more prosperous merchants. She was speaking at a volume calibrated carefully to be heard at adjacent tables, and what she was saying as he processed it through the noise of the diner was this: poor man. It must be so difficult for him. He was extraordinary once. The coal ranch was something to see. A sigh. These reversals happen so quickly on the frontier. One bad season, a few poor investments. She shook her head. I always feared the distance from proper society would affect his judgment eventually. Nathan stopped inside the doorway. Margaret hadn't seen him yet. The 2 merchant wives were looking at her with the particular expression of women who are receiving information they plan to distribute widely. You knew him well, one of them asked. We were very close, Margaret said. Years ago. I worry about him. Living like this, working for wages, it's not the life he was made for. Nathan walked to a table. He sat down. He was aware with a cold and specific clarity of several things simultaneously. Margaret was telling a story that positioned her as the concerned former intimate of a man who had fallen. She was cementing a version of Nathan Cole in Millhaven's social consciousness before he could offer a competing one. She was doing this because she had not yet confirmed whether the rumors of his continuing wealth were true, and if he was still wealthy, she intended to be the woman who had publicly stood by him in his apparent decline. It was a masterpiece of social calculation. and it was going to reach Emma Larson by morning. He ordered his dinner. He ate it. He watched Margaret perform her concern to the two merchant wives until they excused themselves, and then he watched her register his presence at the table across the room. She came over. "Nathan." She sat down without being invited. "I didn't know you were—" "I heard you," he said. "A beat." She adjusted. "I was only— You were telling two women, I don't know that I've had financial reversals, and my judgment has been affected by frontier living." He kept his voice low and even. "In the diner where Emma Larson works." Margaret's eyes moved to the kitchen door. "Is that relevant?" "What do you want, Margaret?" She looked at him with a candor she rarely deployed, because Margaret had learned that candor used sparingly was the most effective tool in her arsenal. "I made a mistake," she said. 3 years ago. I want to correct it. You told me that at the creek. I mean it." "I know you mean it," he said. "That's not the problem. The problem is why you mean it." He looked at her directly. "You came here because you heard the railroad contracts expanded. You heard about the grazing land purchase last spring. You came to see whether the fortune was real and whether there was still a position available." She didn't deny it. That at least he could respect. "And if it is," she said, "if I'm being honest about what I want, is that worse than pretending?" "No," he said. "It's not worse than pretending. It's just—" He paused. "It's not what I want. It hasn't been what I want for a long time." She looked at him with something genuine briefly, and then managed back into position. "The woman from the creek," she said. "That's not your concern." "She's a waitress, Nathan." "Yes," he said. "She is." "And you're—" "I know what I am." He stood up. "Margaret, go home. Build something good for yourself. You're capable of it. I mean that." He left money for his dinner on the table. "But don't come back here." He walked out. Emma heard it the next morning. Nathan knew because Mrs. Caldwell, who lacked entirely the capacity for strategic information management, greeted him at breakfast with the energetic anxiety of a woman sitting on news she can no longer contain. "There's been some talk," she told him before he'd taken his first sip of coffee. "About you specifically. A woman well-dressed came in from Helena told the Prentice women last evening at Hollis's that you'd had financial troubles. Reversals, she called them." Mrs. Caldwell's expression was the kind that asks a question without asking it. "It isn't true," Nathan said. "I didn't think so." Mrs. Caldwell drew herself up with the dignity of a woman whose instincts had been confirmed. "Emma came in this morning early. She heard it from Mrs. Prentice before she'd been awake 20 minutes. Is she here?" "She left for Hollis's already. Early shift." He drank his coffee in 4 minutes and walked to the diner. Emma was restocking the sugar bowls along the counter when he came in. She looked up. Something moved through her expression, not surprise because Emma rarely looked surprised, but a kind of careful bracing. "You've heard," he said. "Mrs. Prentice told me." She set down the sugar bowl in her hand. "She said your former fiancé told half the diner you'd lost your fortune." "She was—" He stopped. "It was a manipulation. She wanted to establish a story before I could." Emma looked at him. "Nathan," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Yes?" "When you came to Millhaven." A pause. "The flannel shirt, the boarding house room, all of it. Was any part of it real, or was the entire thing a performance from the first morning?" He held her gaze. "The clothes were chosen," he said. "The room was chosen. The ranch hand story by omission was chosen. All of that was deliberate." He didn't look away. "But everything else, every conversation, every morning at the river, everything I told you about my parents and the ranch and what happened with Margaret, all of that was real. I wasn't performing those things. I was telling you the truth about the inside of my life while lying to you about the outside of it." She absorbed this with the stillness she brought to things that mattered. "That's a strange distinction," she said. "I know." Most people would say the outside is part of the truth, too. They'd be right. She turned the sugar bowl in her hands, a small revolving motion, unconscious. He had learned her tells. That one meant she was working through something difficult. Your former fiancé is still in town, she said. For her to go home. And she will? I think so, yes. Emma set the sugar bowl down. She looked at him with an expression that had moved through its various layers and arrived somewhere quieter. Not resolved, he could see it wasn't resolved, but settled into a kind of temporary honesty. I don't know how to feel about you right now, she said. I want you to know that. Not because of the money is irrelevant to me, you know that. But because I trusted the shape of what I thought this was, and it turns out the shape was wrong, and She stopped. I'm recalculating. I understand. I don't know if what we built on a false foundation is still standing, she said. I don't know how to test that. He almost laughed, not from humor, but from the precise irony of the word test in this context. Emma, he said, I don't want to give you anything. I don't want to offer you something and have you wonder later whether it was real. He paused. I want to keep talking to you. That's the only thing I actually want. She looked at him for a long moment. Then come back tonight, she said. At 8. We'll talk. He came back at 8. She was there. They talked. They talked past 9 past 10, until Mrs. Hollis started turning chairs onto tables around them and gave them the pointed look of a woman who had a kitchen to lock. It wasn't a resolution. It didn't tie anything up cleanly. But it was honest for the first time, completely honest on both sides. And when Emma finally put on her coat, and Nathan held the door for her, and they stood for a moment in the cold outside the diner, something had shifted. Not fixed, not repaired, but shifted. Samuel asked about you today, she said. He wants to know your opinion on a problem he's working through about railroad bridge spans. Nathan looked at her. Tell him I'll come by tomorrow afternoon, he said. If that's all right. I'll tell him, she said. She turned to go, stopped, looked back over her shoulder. Nathan? Her voice was careful, even. The voice of a woman who is about to say something she has thought about for days and is choosing deliberately to say. I put those coins on the table because of who I am, not because of who you were pretending to be. A breath. But what happens next, whatever that is, has to be built on what's actually true, not what either of us decided to show. She walked home in the dark. He stood outside the diner and let the cold settle through his coat, and thought about what it meant that she had said what happens next. Not there is no next. What happens next? And for a man who had spent 3 years designing exits, the difference between those two sentences was everything. He found out the following morning where Margaret was staying, the Millhaven Hotel Room 4, and he wrote her a short letter. Not cruel, not detailed. Simply clear, he wished her well, he bore her no ill will, and there was nothing here for her to come back to. He left the letter with the hotel desk and did not check for a reply. She was gone by noon. He knew because Millhaven was small enough that her departure was observed by at least 4 people, who mentioned it to Mrs. Caldwell, who mentioned it to Nathan while he was fixing another hinge on the parlor door. Good riddance, Mrs. Caldwell said with the unself-conscious satisfaction of a woman expressing a widely held community position. Nathan tightened the last screw and didn't respond. He was thinking about Emma's words from the night before. What's actually true? He had told her the truth about the ranch, the money, Margaret, the tests. But there was one more truth he hadn't said, a simpler, more fundamental one that existed underneath all the other truths, and was the reason all the other truths had been so difficult to say. He was going to have to say that one too. He wasn't ready, but he could feel the shape of the moment approaching, the way he could feel a Montana weather system approaching in the quality of the air, the particular pressure of the days, the sense that something was building toward a point of no return. He set down his screwdriver. He went to visit Samuel. Samuel was at his table, as he almost always was surrounded by papers. But today there was something different on the table. Alongside the bridge drawings, a letter opened, sitting at the edge of the spread. Samuel looked up when Nathan came in. His expression, usually so focused and controlled, was doing something complicated. "What is it?" Nathan asked. Samuel pushed the letter across the table. It was from the Territorial Surveyor's office in Helena. Nathan read it twice. The territorial engineer, a man named Aldous Webb, had reviewed the preliminary bridge assessment documents S. Larson had submitted over the past 8 months. He found them. He wrote of exceptional quality and requested a meeting to discuss whether S. Larson would be willing to consult on an upcoming territorial infrastructure project. He had addressed the letter with no further information to S. Larson Millhaven. He still didn't know he was writing to a 16-year-old who couldn't walk. Nathan set the letter down. He looked at Samuel. Samuel's jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the table. He was working very hard, Nathan could see, to hold his expression together. "You're going to write back," Nathan said. "He'll find out," Samuel said. When he does, he'll have 8 months of work proving that you are exactly who you say you are." Nathan pushed the letter back across the table. "Write back. Tell him you're available to meet." Samuel looked at the letter. "Emma will never let me go to Helena alone," he said. "She can't take the time away from work." "She won't have to," Nathan said. Samuel looked up at him. Nathan held his gaze. "I'll take you," he said. "Both of you, if she'll come. We'll go to Helena, you'll meet with Webb, and whatever happens after that, we'll figure it out." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You know she doesn't accept things from people." "I know," Nathan said. "This isn't a thing. This is—" He paused, searching for the right word. The one that would satisfy Emma's standard. "This is one person helping another person do what they were meant to do. That's not charity. That's just the right thing." Samuel looked at him with the same evaluating quality his sister had, the directness of people who have learned that the world does not always align with what it presents itself as, and have developed an eye for the gap. "She likes you," Samuel said, not as a revelation, as information delivered plainly. "I know," Nathan said. "She's also furious at you." "I know that too." Samuel looked at his letter. "She's never been both things at the same time before," he said. "About a person." He picked up his pencil. "I think that means something." Nathan stood up from the chair. "Write the letter," he said. "I'll talk to Emma." He walked to the door. Behind him, Samuel's pencil was already moving. Emma said no. Not with anger, not with the particular coldness she might have been entitled to after everything that had happened in the past week. She said it the way she said most difficult things, quietly, with her hands occupied, so she didn't have to look at him while she said it. "I'm not taking anything from you, Nathan. Not a wagon, not a trip, not a hotel room in Helena." She was folding linens at the boarding house table, morning light coming through the window, and she kept folding. "I know what you'll say. I know you'll say it's for Samuel, and maybe it is, but it comes through you, and right now I can't—" She stopped. "I need the lines to be clear. The meeting with Webb is real," Nathan said. "Samuel's work earned that letter." "I know it did. He can't get to Helena on his own." "I know that too." She set a folded sheet aside. "I'll find a way. I always find a way." "Emma." "Nathan." She looked up at him then. Direct as always, but with something underneath the directness that he had not seen there before. Something that looked, if he read it correctly, like the specific exhaustion of a person who is working very hard to protect themselves and is not entirely sure the protection is worth the cost. "I'm not saying never. I'm saying not yet. I'm saying I need," she exhaled. "I need a week where I'm not figuring out who you are. Can you give me that?" He could. It was the hardest thing he'd been asked to do in recent memory, but he could. "Yes," he said. She nodded. Went back to the linens. He left. He gave her the week. He stayed in Millhaven because leaving felt like abandonment, and because he had nowhere else to be that mattered more than this. He spent his days usefully. He helped Hicks by wire with a grazing rotation question that required 3 exchanges to resolve. He rode out to assess some land north of Millhaven that a homesteader was considering selling. He fixed every loose and broken thing Mrs. Caldwell showed him, with the grateful efficiency of a woman who had not had a competent handyman in 2 years. He saw Emma at meal at the boarding house counter, passing on Main Street. They spoke practical things: the weather, a question she had about the territorial land registry that related to something Samuel was working through, a brief exchange about a book he'd borrowed from the general store's small lending shelf that she had apparently read twice. It was not the river mornings, but it was not nothing. On the 4th day of the week, he came downstairs in the morning to find Samuel at the boarding house table. This was unprecedented. Samuel rarely came to the boarding house. The distance from their small house across town was manageable, but not easy, and Samuel had the particular pride of a person who has decided he will not be moved from place to place like cargo unless the destination is worth the effort. He was sitting very straight in his chair, his hands on the table, a folded letter in front of him. Nathan sat down across from him. "Webb wrote back," Samuel said. "Already. He sent a rider." Samuel's voice was controlled in a way that meant he was managing something significant underneath it. "He wants to meet in 10 days, in Helena. He says—" Samuel stopped, unfolded the letter, read directly from it, his voice steady. "He says the bridge assessment work is among the finest preliminary analysis he has received from any consultant, credentialed or otherwise, and he wishes to discuss a formal consulting arrangement for the territorial infrastructure project." Nathan looked at him. Samuel was 16 years old, and he was sitting at a boarding house table in a frontier town 40 miles from anywhere, and the territorial engineer of Montana had just called his work the finest he had received from any consultant, credentialed or otherwise. "Formal consulting arrangement," Nathan said. "Yes. That means they'd pay you." Something moved across Samuel's face, a flicker of something young and unguarded that the controlled expression immediately managed back into place. "Yes," he said. "It would appear so." Nathan sat with that for a moment. "Have you told Emma?" "Not yet." Samuel folded the letter with careful precision. "I wanted to talk to you first." "Why?" Samuel looked at him with the directness that was the most characteristic thing about the Larson family, that quality of seeing clearly and saying what they saw without ornamentation. "Because she won't let you pay for anything," he said. "But she can't say no to this. This is mine. I earned it." A pause. "And getting there requires you." "Samuel, I'm not asking you to trick her," Samuel said sharply. "I'm not interested in that. I'm asking you to come with us because the wagon and the road require someone who knows them, and because—" He stopped. The controlled expression did something more complicated. "Because you're the person she's most likely to be all right with. Even now." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Even now," he said. "She's angry at you," Samuel said. "I already told you that. But the way she's angry is the way you're angry at someone who mattered enough to disappoint you." He set the letter flat on the table. "That's different from the way you're angry at someone who doesn't matter at all." Nathan looked at the letter. He thought about Emma's hands not entirely steady when she'd reached for her apron ties at the diner counter. He thought about what happens next. He thought about the specific quality of the week they had just spent in the adjacent warmth of ordinary conversation, neither of them pushing both of them, waiting for something neither of them had quite named. "All right," he said. "Tell Emma, then we'll talk about Helena." Emma came to find him that evening. He was in the boarding house yard rehanging a gate that had been off its hinges for apparently some months, and she came around the side of the building with her coat on against the cold and stood watching him for a moment before she spoke. "Samuel told me about Webb's letter," she said. "I know. He also told me you two talked this morning." "We did." A pause. "He wants you to take us," she said. "He asked me to come along," Nathan said carefully. "The decision is yours." Emma was quiet. He kept working on the gate hinge not because it required his full attention, but because the activity gave both of them somewhere to put their eyes that wasn't each other. "If I say yes," she said, "I need to be clear about something. Tell me. This is Samuel's meeting, his work, his opportunity." Her voice was precise. "You're the wagon and the road. You're not the patron, and we're not the charity case. The moment it starts feeling like the latter, we go home." "Agreed," he said, without hesitation. She looked at the gate hinge. "And when we come back," she said, "we're going to have the rest of that conversation." "Which part?" "The part you almost said at the river," she said, "before Margaret appeared on the path and you ran out of time." He set the hinge pin. "I wasn't running out of time," he said. "I was looking for courage." She was quiet for a moment. "Did you find it?" she asked. "Getting there," he said. Something shifted in her expression, almost a smile, brief and controlled, but real. "All right," she said. "Helena." She went back inside. Nathan stood at the gate and tested the swing of it, smooth now, properly seated, and thought that fixing a gate hinge was in its small way a fine thing to have done with an evening. Right. They left for Helena 3 days later before first light. Nathan drove. Emma sat beside him on the wagon bench. Samuel was in the wagon bed, propped against his traveling pack, his portfolio of drawings secured in an oilcloth wrap beside him. He had not slept the previous night. Emma told Nathan this quietly, while Samuel was occupied with his papers and had eaten almost nothing at breakfast. "He doesn't show nerves the way most people do," Emma said low. "He gets very still, very methodical, like he's running the calculations in his head over and over until they come out right." "Does that help him?" Nathan asked. "I think so." A pause. "I do the same thing." He glanced at her. She was looking at the road ahead, and in the early cold light, she looked for a moment very young. Not young the way Emma usually looked, which was competent and self-possessed, and only incidentally young, but genuinely young. Like someone sitting beside a decision she's made and hasn't finished making yet. "Emma," he said. "Don't," she said, quietly. "Not on the road. We'll talk when we're back." He nodded. They drove. The Territorial Engineer's office was on the second floor of a building near the Helena Assay Office, a place of considerable purpose and no decorative ambition, which Nathan suspected would suit Samuel perfectly. Aldous Webb was 60, compact and sharp-eyed in the manner of a man who had spent 40 years assessing whether things would hold weight. He came to the door himself when they knocked and looked at Nathan, then at Emma, then at some length at Samuel in his wheeled chair, which Nathan and Emma had carried up the stairs between them without ceremony. Webb did the calculation that his face made briefly visible. This was S. Larson, the hand behind 8 months of exceptional analysis. This was a boy of 16 who could not walk. Nathan watched him complete the calculation and arrive somewhere on the other side of it. "Mr. Larson," Webb said. He offered his hand to Samuel, who shook it with the straight-backed formality of someone who had decided he was going to conduct himself as a professional, regardless of what the room thought about his age or his chair. "Mr. Webb," Samuel said, "I appreciate you making time." "I appreciate you making the trip." Webb stepped back. "Come in." Nathan and Emma waited in the hallway. Emma sat on a wooden bench. Nathan stood. From behind the closed door came the sound of voices. Webb's deliberate and questioning Samuel's precise and confident and occasional silences that Nathan recognized as the silences of two people looking at drawings together. "He's all right," Emma said. It wasn't a question. She was steadying herself, not asking him. "He's more than all right," Nathan said. "Listen to his voice." She listened. Samuel's voice through the door was the voice of a person who has walked into the room he was meant to be in and recognized it immediately. Emma's hands clasped in her lap loosened slightly. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When the door opened, Samuel came out with the portfolio under his arm and an expression that was doing its very best to remain neutral and not entirely succeeding. Webb appeared behind him in the doorway. "Mr. Cole," Webb said. He had apparently identified Nathan during the meeting. "I understand you're acquainted with the Larson family." "I am," Nathan said. "I'd like you to know," Webb said, "that your young friend here has identified 3 structural vulnerabilities in the Clearwater Bridge preliminary design that my senior engineers missed." He said it with the equanimity of a man secure enough professional standing to be pleased rather than embarrassed by this. "I intend to bring those corrections to the project, with full credit to the consultant." Emma made a sound small involuntary that she immediately controlled. "Thank you," Nathan said. Webb nodded at Samuel. "I'll have the formal consulting paperwork sent to Millhaven within the week. The rate is standard for licensed consultants. I see no reason to offer you anything different." He paused. "Age and circumstance are not the same as quality. The work is the work." Samuel said, "Thank you, Mr. Webb." His voice was steady. His hands gripping the portfolio were not. Webb went back inside. Nathan pulled the office door closed. The 3 of them stood in the hallway, and Emma looked at her brother, and Samuel looked at his drawings, and then Emma crossed the hallway and put her arms around him. Not the careful, managed embrace of a person conserving herself, but something real and unguarded, and Samuel let her, which he rarely did in front of other people. Nathan looked at the wall. He gave them the moment. When Emma stepped back, her eyes were bright in a way she immediately managed. Samuel straightened his portfolio. "The rate is standard for licensed consultants," Samuel said. His voice was very controlled. "He said that." "I heard," Emma said. "That's not—" Samuel stopped. "I wasn't expecting that." "I know," Emma said. "Emma." His voice dropped. "This is—" "I know what it is," she said. "We'll talk about it tonight." She looked at Nathan over Samuel's shoulder. And what was in her eyes for the single unguarded second before she controlled it was something that reached directly into the center of his chest and took hold. Gratitude, yes. But underneath the gratitude, something older and quieter. The expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just for one moment been allowed to set it down. Nathan nodded at her. Small private. She looked away. Chapik. They stayed one night in Helena at a hotel Nathan chose carefully clean, respectable, and nothing that would alarm Emma's sense of proportion. He paid for the rooms, and she let him, which he understood was less about him and more about the day, and about the fact that she had not yet rebuilt her defenses back to full height after what had happened in Webb's hallway. He ate dinner alone. Emma stayed with Samuel, who apparently talked for 3 hours about the Clearwater Bridge vulnerabilities and what he planned to say in his formal consulting report, and who fell asleep at the table and had to be maneuvered into the hotel bed by Emma, who had done this many times and had a system. Nathan sat in the hotel dining room with a glass of whiskey he didn't particularly want and thought about the shape of his life. He was 39 years old. He owned more land than most men would see in a lifetime. He had tested 25 women to confirm a wound he had taken 3 years to stop examining, and in the process of that testing, he had done something unkind to 25 people who had probably not deserved the particular trap he'd set for them. He had met a 23-year-old Swedish immigrant who had put tips money on a table and told him to finish his dinner, and in the month since then, had told her more true things about himself than he had told anyone in years, not because he planned to, but because she had a quality of attention that made dishonesty feel like bad workmanship. He thought about what Samuel had said. The first lie protected your heart. The second truth should protect hers. He hadn't said that yet. Samuel had paraphrased it to him the previous week, passing it along as his own observation, but Nathan had turned it over many times since. The geometry of it. The idea that truth in this context was not primarily about his own clarity or his own need to be understood. It was about whether Emma had enough real information to protect herself. Whether she could trust her own judgment about him. She couldn't trust it until he told her everything. Not just the ranch and the money and Margaret. The last thing. The thing underneath all the other things. He put down the whiskey glass and went to bed. They drove back to Millhaven the next morning. Samuel slept in the wagon bed, genuinely this time the deep, dragged undersleep of someone who has spent weeks preparing for a single event and has now come through the other side of it. Emma sat beside Nathan on the bench in the early cold, her hands in her lap, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then she said, "Thank you. For yesterday." "Samuel earned yesterday," Nathan said. "I just drove. You knew about the letter before I did. You talked to him and helped him think it through." She paused. "Don't minimize it. I'm trying to thank you properly." "All right," he said. "You're welcome. Properly." A beat. "Nathan?" Her voice shifted. The particular shift he'd learned meant she was moving from the practical conversation to the real one. "What were you about to say at the river before Margaret came?" He had known it was coming. He had been waiting for it since the morning they left. Helena had spent the 2-hour drive calibrating himself to it. He kept his hands on the reins. "I was going to tell you that I'm in love with you," he said. "I am. I have been for—" He paused. "I'm not sure when it started. Somewhere between the river and the engineering textbook and you telling me that testing people was a sad thing to do." The wagon moved. Emma did not respond immediately. He didn't rush her. "That's the last thing I was hiding," he said. "The money you knew. Margaret you knew. The tests you knew. That one." A breath. "That one I kept back because saying it changes everything, and I wasn't ready for everything to change." "And now?" she asked. "Now I think I've been not ready long enough." The wagon moved along the frozen road. In the bed behind them, Samuel breathed steadily in his sleep. Emma looked at her hands. "I'm afraid," she said. Not as a confession. Emma didn't confess, she stated. "Not of you specifically. Of the size of the difference between your life and mine. Of what it means when a man who owns 42,000 acres tells a waitress he loves her, and whether the story I tell myself about who I am can survive that." A pause. "I've built something very specific, modest and exact and entirely mine. And I'm afraid that if I let it touch yours however carefully, however honestly, I'll lose the thread of it." "You won't," he said. "You can't know that." "No," he said. "You're right. I can't." He let that sit. "What I can tell you is that the thing I feel for you has nothing to do with what you don't have. It has to do with what you are. With the cloth pouch on the table, and the engineering textbook, and the way you look at Samuel when he explains something you're working to understand." He paused. "I don't want to change what you've built. I want to—" He stopped, found the right word. "I want to be someone who's worth building alongside. If you ever decide that's something you want." Emma was quiet. A long quiet. The kind he had learned over these weeks in Millhaven to sit inside without filling. "I need time," she said finally. "Not because I don't." She stopped. Started again. "Not because the answer is no, but because I need to be sure that when I give you an answer, it comes from the right place. Not from gratitude, not from the relief of yesterday, from something solid." "I know," he said. "You'll wait, Emma." He looked at her briefly, long enough to mean it. "I tested 25 women to find something real. I'm not walking away from real because it asks me to be patient." Something in her face, not quite a smile, but its close relative. The expression of a person who has just heard exactly the right thing, said in exactly the right way. She looked back at the road. They drove. 2 days after they returned to Millhaven, Nathan went to Hollis's diner in the middle of the afternoon. Not Emma's shift deliberately, and asked to speak to Walt Hollis, who owned the place, and had the solid assessed quality of a man who had been part of Millhaven long enough to understand its entire social architecture. He told Walt Hollis who he was, not to impress, not to establish, but because what he was about to do required that Millhaven understand the context, and Hollis was in Nathan's assessment the person most likely to transmit that context accurately. Hollis listened with his arms crossed and his expression unchanged, which Nathan respected. "Coal cattle operation," Hollis said. "Outside Helena?" "Yes." "The railroad contracts?" Yes. And you've been living at Agnes Caldwell's boarding house for 6 weeks in a flannel shirt. Yes. Hollis was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm going to say something publicly in the next few days, Nathan said. And I want there to be at least one person in Millhaven who already knows the truth before I say it, so that what I say doesn't look like a performance. Hollis looked at him for a long moment with the particular assessment of a man who has heard a great many things across a diner counter and has developed a reliable sense for the difference between genuine and constructed. You're going to tell people you lied, Hollis said. I'm going to tell people what I did, Nathan said. And why? And accept whatever they think about it. Hollis uncrossed his arms. You want some coffee? He said. Yes, Nathan said. Hollis got the coffee.
Sherry.
He did it on a Sunday. The Millhaven community gathered informally after the Sunday service in the open space in front of the church. Not a formal assembly, just the natural accumulation of a small town's social gravity on its one day of rest. People stood around in the cold with their breath-making clouds talking about the week's news and the weather and the state of the territorial road. Nathan waited until the crowd had reached its full-size 30, perhaps 35 people, and then he walked into the middle of it. He did not stand on anything. He simply stopped walking and started talking. I want to say something, he said. Not loudly. But in Millhaven, where the social space was small and the crowd was compact, he didn't need volume. The talking around him dropped away in sections as people noticed. My name is Nathan Cole. I own the Cole Cattle Operation outside Helena, 42,000 acres railroad investments and holdings that most of you deserve to know about, given that I've been living here for 6 weeks, presenting myself as something considerably less. He paused. Let that sit. I did it deliberately. I've been doing it in various towns for 3 years, testing people, specifically testing women, whether they would stay or leave when they thought I had nothing. The silence in the crowd was complete. He saw Mrs. Caldwell's face surprise, then rapid processing. He saw Walt Hollis standing at the edge, arms crossed, expression neutral. He saw 2 of the merchant wives who had listened to Margaret's performance at the diner. He saw at the far edge of the gathered people, Emma Larson. She had not known he was going to do this. He had not told her, because he needed her to see it, and not have been consulted about it, needed her to see it as a choice he made alone, not a performance they had rehearsed together. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read at this distance. He held her gaze for a single second, and then looked back at the crowd. I'm not asking for your approval, he said. I'm telling you what I did because the people in this town... He stopped. Because you deserve to know who was living in your community, and because there is one person here in particular who deserved better than what I gave her, and I want that said in front of witnesses, not in private where it's easier. He did not look at Emma when he said it. He didn't need to. Everyone else looked at her, which told him she was still there. I came to Millhaven to find something I'd stopped believing existed, he said. I found it, and I almost lost it because I couldn't stop hiding long enough to let it be real. A breath. I'm done hiding. Whatever you all think of that. He looked around the crowd at the 35 faces, at the range of expressions moving from surprise to calculating to something that looked on several of them like reluctant respect. I'll accept it. He stopped talking. The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then Mrs. Caldwell said from the middle of the crowd with the decisive clarity of a woman who has made up her mind, well, at least he fixed the hinges. A sound moved through the crowd, not quite laughter, but its first cousin. The sound of tension releasing into something more manageable. Walt Hollis uncrossed his arms. The crowd began gradually to return to its Sunday conversations. Nathan stood where he was. He heard footsteps behind him, not the crowd's general movement, but specific ones. A particular rhythm he had learned over 6 weeks. He turned. Emma was standing 3 feet from him. She had her coat on, and her hair in its usual escaping pins arrangement, and she was looking at him with an expression that had resolved itself out of its various layers into something clear and direct and unguarded in a way that her expressions almost never were. You didn't tell me, she said. No. Why? Because I needed you to see it happen, he said, not approve it in advance. She looked at him for a long moment. That was, she started. Overdue, he said. I was going to say brave, she said. But overdue works too. He looked at her. She held his gaze. Nathan, she said, I've had the time I asked for. His heart hit his chest wall. And, he said. She didn't answer immediately. She reached into her coat pocket, an automatic gesture, the gesture of a woman who keeps her hands occupied, and brought out a small cloth pouch. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. I don't need you to have nothing, she said. I never did. I need you to be, she paused, what you were for the last 20 minutes. What you were at the river, what you were in Webb's hallway. She held his gaze. The man who stops hiding, that's the man I want to know. He said nothing. He didn't need to. She put the cloth pouch back in her pocket and looked at him with the same directness she'd had from the very first morning, but warmer now, and quieter, and entirely real. Samuel wants to show you the corrections he's writing for the Clearwater report, she said. He says you'll understand the structural argument better than I do. He's probably right, Nathan said. He usually is. The almost smile that he had learned to recognize as Emma at her most genuine. Come for dinner tonight. Yes, he said. She nodded. She turned to go. Emma, he said. She stopped, looked back. I'm sorry, he said, for the shape of it, for all the weeks where you didn't have the full truth. She considered him for a moment. I know, she said. That's most of why I'm inviting you to dinner. She walked away across the Sunday crowd. Nathan stood where he was in the cold in Millhaven, in the full complicated light of everything he had just said, and everything that had just been offered back to him. He thought about Margaret's 4 sentences, and the sapphire ring returned in an envelope. He thought about 25 women, and 3 years, and a wound he had dressed as an experiment. He thought about a cloth pouch of tips set on a table without ceremony, and a sentence that had stopped his entire world. He started walking toward Emma's house for dinner. Dinner that evening was salt pork and boiled potatoes and bread that Emma had made herself, and Nathan ate 3 portions of it without noticing what he was eating, because Samuel had the Clearwater Bridge corrections spread across half the table before they'd finished the first course. Here, Samuel said, pushing a sheet toward him. This is the load distribution problem. Webb's senior engineers calculated the span tolerance based on summer material measurements. They didn't account for iron contraction in February. He tapped the paper. At minus 20 degrees, this joint loses approximately 12% of its rated tensile capacity. Under full load, a heavily laden freight wagon, 6 horses, the failure point isn't the primary span. It's here. His pencil landed on a junction point midway along the drawing. A secondary support that nobody thought to stress test, because it looks adequate on paper in July. Nathan looked at the drawing. He looked at Samuel's calculations. He followed the logic step by step, and by the 3rd step, he understood exactly what the boy was describing, had in fact ridden across bridges like this, and felt something uncertain in the deck planking without knowing why. You found this from the preliminary drawings alone, Nathan said, without visiting the site. The drawings are sufficient if you know what to look for, Samuel said. Webb's senior engineers had the drawings. Webb's senior engineers were trained in Ohio, Samuel said, with zero arrogance, just as a fact. Nathan set the paper down. He looked at this 16-year-old who could not walk and had never attended a single day of formal engineering school and had just from a table in a 2-room house in Millhaven identified a structural failure that would have put lives at risk on a territorial bridge. Samuel, he said, I want to talk to you about something. Emma, who was clearing the dinner plates, went still. The consulting arrangement with Webb is real and it's yours, Nathan said. That's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about what comes after that. What a formal education would make possible. Not for me. He held up one hand before Samuel could speak. Not as my investment. As a scholarship through the Territorial Engineering Fund. It exists. Webb knows about it. He mentioned it to me when I spoke with him privately before we left Helena. Samuel's expression did not move. He mentioned it, Samuel said carefully. He said the fund exists specifically for candidates who demonstrate exceptional ability outside formal training channels. Nathan kept his voice level factual. He said the committee reviews applications twice yearly. He said... Nathan paused. He said if S. Larson were to apply, he would write the supporting letter himself. The room was completely quiet. Emma had stopped moving entirely. She was standing with a stack of plates in her hands, looking at her brother. Samuel looked at his drawings. At the bridge junction, he had marked with his pencil. At the calculations that had earned a letter from the territorial engineer, a formal consulting arrangement, and apparently, the attention of a scholarship committee in Helena. That's different from charity, Samuel said, slowly, testing the shape of the words. Completely different, Nathan said. That's the world working the way it should. Those are your words. Emma's words. Samuel looked at his sister. Emma set the plates down on the sideboard. She didn't look at Nathan. She looked at Samuel, and what moved across her face in the space of 3 seconds was the entire history of the past 2 years. The wagon accident, and the lost parents, and the 16-hour days, and the sewing done in the margins of other people's sleep moving through her, and arriving somewhere on the other side that looked, if Nathan was reading it right, like the specific relief of a weight being set down by someone who has carried it so long, they'd forgotten it was possible to set it down. Sam, she said. Her voice was steady, just barely. Samuel picked up his pencil, set it down, picked it up again. I would need to write the application, he said. Yes, Nathan said. And the supporting documentation, the full portfolio. Yes. That would take, Samuel calculated, 3 weeks, if I work every day. Then start tomorrow, Nathan said. Samuel looked at his drawings for a long moment. Then he looked at Nathan with the same evaluating directness that was the most characteristic thing about him and his sister both. Why are you doing this? Samuel asked. Not suspiciously, genuinely. The question of a person who wants to understand a thing completely before he accepts it. Nathan thought about that for a real moment before answering. Because your bridges are going to hold weight someday, he said. Real weight, real people crossing real rivers in February in Montana, and I'd like to have been someone who helped make that possible. He paused. That's the honest answer. Samuel held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and uncapped his pen. Then I'll start tonight, he said. Emma walked Nathan to the door an hour later, while Samuel worked at the table behind them, already absorbed in the application framework, pen, moving with the focused speed of someone who has been waiting for exactly this task. They stood at the door in the cold, and neither of them spoke for a moment. You talked to Webb privately, Emma said. Not an accusation, an observation with a question inside it. Before we left his office, Nathan said. While you were with Samuel in the hallway. You planned that. I asked a question. The answer was what it was. She looked at him. The cold moved between them. Nathan, she said, you keep doing things that make it very difficult to maintain a reasonable amount of caution about you. Is that a complaint? He asked. I'm still deciding, she said. But the almost smile was there. Genuine, unguarded, the one he had spent 6 weeks learning to recognize as Emma at her least defended. Go home, she said. It's cold. Emma, we'll talk, she said. Properly. Not at a door at night with Samuel 10 feet away. She held his gaze. Soon. He nodded. He walked back to Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house through the cold Millhaven night and went to sleep for the first time in weeks, without the stone of an unresolved thing sitting on his chest. The scholarship application took Samuel 22 days. Nathan knew this because Emma told him in the fragments of real conversation they managed between her shifts and his increasingly complex correspondence with Hicks about the upcoming winter cattle arrangements, which required decisions that could not wait for his return from Millhaven indefinitely. He had been in Millhaven for nearly 2 months. He needed to go back to the ranch. He had not yet said this to Emma. He said it on a Wednesday evening when she sat across from him at the boarding house parlor table. Mrs. Caldwell had tactfully produced tea and then disappeared, and they had settled into the particular honesty that had become the characteristic mode of every real conversation between them. "I have to go back to Helena," he said. "Within the week. The winter grazing rotation decisions need me present. There are contracts that require my signature." Emma absorbed this without visible reaction. "I know," she said. "You know, I've known you'd have to go back for 2 weeks," she said. "You've been managing a 42,000-acre cattle operation by telegraph from a boarding house in Millhaven. That's not sustainable." He looked at her. "You never said anything." "It wasn't my place to say anything," she said. "Your business is your business." "Emma, it is," she said, not defensively. "That's not me being distant. That's me being accurate." She wrapped both hands around her teacup. "What I want to know is what you're asking me." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you to come to Helena," he said. That's not something that can be decided over tea in a boarding house parlor." He paused. "I'm telling you I have to leave. And I'm asking whether when the application is submitted and Samuel's consulting work is established, and the shape of things becomes clearer, whether there's something here worth coming back to." Emma looked at her tea. He waited. "Nathan," she said, "there has been something worth coming back to since approximately the second Sunday at the river." She looked up at him. "I've been trying to be sure I knew what it was before I said so." "And now I'm sure," she said, simply, without drama. In the way Emma said everything that mattered directly, having thought it through completely, meaning every word. He looked at her across the parlor table. "I'll be back," he said, "within the month, after the grazing decisions." "I'll be here," she said. "Within the month I expect to have heard from Webb's office about the scholarship timeline. Samuel will want to tell you himself. Then I'll make sure I'm back before they write." She nodded, picked up her tea, drank. "Nathan," she said. "Yes." "Don't test anything else while you're gone." He looked at her. The expression on her face was the closest thing to humor he had seen there, dry, precise, completely genuine. "No," he said. "I'm done with that." "Good," she said. He left on a Friday morning. Mrs. Caldwell packed him a traveling meal without being asked and delivered it to his wagon with the affectionate efficiency of a woman who has decided she approves of a person and intends to feed them accordingly. He paid his full 6 weeks of board and added a month's advance for the room he told her he'd be coming back to. Mrs. Caldwell looked at the advance money, looked at him. "She's a good woman," she said, not as information, as a statement of position. "I know," Nathan said. "The best one I've met in 20 years of running this house." Mrs. Caldwell continued, with the unhurried certainty of someone who has earned the right to say what they think. "And she has had, if you'll forgive me saying so, very limited exposure to men worth the trouble." "I'm aware of that," Nathan said. "Good," said Mrs. Caldwell. She handed him the traveling meal. "Then don't be one of the ones who isn't." He drove out of Millhaven with the sun just above the ridge and the cold coming through his coat in layers, and he didn't look back, because he was afraid that if he did, he would turn the wagon around. The ranch was exactly as he had left it. Hicks had managed it with the competent indifference of a man who treats every obstacle as a logistical problem and every logistical problem as solvable. The cattle were in reasonable condition. The winter grazing rotation required 2 days of focused decision-making and one hard conversation with a neighboring rancher about a contested fence line. The railroad contracts required a trip to Helena and 3 hours with a lawyer whose hourly rate suggested he had read more books than Nathan had owned at any point in his life. He handled all of it in 11 days. He sent a wire to Millhaven General Delivery on the 12th day. Returning Friday. Tell Samuel to have the application ready. Emma's reply came the next afternoon, a single line. It's already ready. Has been for 4 days. He's been waiting for you to come back before submitting it. Nathan read the wire twice. He thought about Samuel sitting at his table for 22 days, with the pen moving, and then sitting for 4 more days, with the finished application in front of him waiting. He left for Millhaven on Thursday instead of Friday. He arrived in the late afternoon to find the lamp already lit in Emma's small house, and Samuel at the table with the application portfolio squared in front of him, like a man who has laid out everything he owns and is prepared for judgment. Nathan came in. He sat down. "Show me," he said. Samuel showed him. The application was 43 pages. Formal analysis of 6 territorial bridge projects identifying structural issues across 4 of them with mathematical precision. 3 original bridge designs for hypothetical Montana-specific conditions. High gradient, severe temperature variance, spring flood load with full load calculations and material specifications. 2 letters of recommendation. One from Webb and one to Nathan's considerable surprise from a professor at the University of Michigan who had apparently been corresponding with S. Larson for 8 months about iron fatigue theory. "Professor Ainsworth," Samuel said when Nathan reached that letter. "I wrote him about a paper he published in 1878. He wrote back. We've been..." A slight pause. "We correspond regularly." Nathan looked at the Michigan professor's letter. S. Larson demonstrates a quality of analytical reasoning that I encounter perhaps once a decade among my own graduate students, Ainsworth had written. I recommend this candidate without qualification and with genuine enthusiasm. Nathan set the letters down. "Samuel," he said. "Yes. This is the best piece of work I have ever seen produced under these circumstances by anyone of any age." Samuel's expression did the complicated thing it did when he was managing something significant. "Submit it tomorrow," Nathan said. "Tomorrow," Samuel said, and picked up the portfolio with the care of a man handling something irreplaceable. Emma from the kitchen doorway said nothing, but when Nathan looked at her, she was looking at her brother with an expression that required no interpretation at all. The scholarship committee's response arrived in Millhaven 6 weeks later. Nathan was there when it came. He had returned to Millhaven 18 days after leaving the ranch. Management sorted the contracts, signed Hicks installed with clear authority for the winter months. And he had taken his room back at Mrs. Caldwell's and resumed the rhythm of the town with the ease of someone returning somewhere familiar, which was he realized exactly what he was doing. Emma had not made any pronouncements about his return. She had simply, when he came to the boarding house on his first morning back, brought him his coffee before he asked for it. That was sufficient. They had rebuilt the river mornings, not at the river, because November in Montana had made the creek path impractical, but in the boarding house parlor in the mornings, before the other boarders came down with tea, instead of the open air, and the sound of the building settling in the cold, instead of the cottonwoods. They talked about the ranch. Emma had begun asking real questions about the cattle operation, specific and detailed, and Nathan answered with the full complexity of the truth, rather than the simplified version he'd have offered anyone else. They talked about Samuel's application now submitted and pending, which Samuel refused to discuss directly, but whose presence was visible in the particular keyed-up quality he carried like a held breath. They talked about Emma's sewing business. She had acquired in Nathan's absence 2 new regular clients' wives of homesteaders north of town, who had heard about her work from the merchant wives and had spent 3 evenings pricing out what it would cost to rent the small empty room behind the general store as a dedicated workspace with proper light and a cutting table and room to hang finished work. "The numbers work," she told Nathan one morning with the focused concentration she brought to financial calculations. "If I keep both current clients and add one more, the rent is manageable within 6 months." "What's stopping you?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I'm going to do it." She looked at him directly. "I wanted to tell you, not ask." "I know the difference," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That's why I'm telling you." He thought about that exchange for 2 days afterward, about the precision of it, about what it meant that she had drawn that line so clearly, not to exclude him, but to define the shape of what she was offering. A partnership between people who remained fully and separately themselves. He thought about the fact that he had spent 3 years looking for someone who would not leave when he appeared to have nothing, and had found instead something considerably more interesting, someone who would not subsume herself when he revealed he had everything. The committee's letter arrived on a Tuesday. Samuel was at his table. Emma was at her morning shift at the boarding house. Nathan was in the parlor when Mrs. Caldwell came in with the post and handed him a letter addressed to S. Larson General Delivery, Millhaven, Montana Territory, with the return address of the Montana Territorial Engineering Scholarship Committee, Helena. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. Then he put on his coat and walked to Emma's house. Samuel answered the door. He had a system for managing it independently that Nathan had learned not to comment on, and saw Nathan's face and then the letter in his hand and went very still. Nathan held it out. Samuel took it. He looked at it for a long moment without opening it. His hands, Nathan noticed, were completely steady. Samuel's hands were always steady when something genuinely mattered, as though the steadiness were a decision he made consciously every time. "Open it," Nathan said. Samuel opened it. He read it. His face did not change dramatically. It moved through something a flicker quickly managed and then settled into a stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. Deeper, more complete. He held the letter out to Nathan. Nathan read it. Full scholarship, 4-year program. University of Michigan. Not a local institution, not a territorial compromise, but the actual Michigan program, where Professor Ainsworth taught, which had apparently reached out to the scholarship committee independently after Ainsworth submitted his recommendation. Room and board covered. A monthly stipend for materials. The committee had included a personal note from the chairman. We do not often offer first-year placements with full stipend. We are offering it in this case because we do not wish the territory's most promising engineering mind to accept any alternative arrangement out of financial necessity. Nathan set the letter down on the table. He looked at Samuel. Samuel was looking at the window. "Michigan," Samuel said. "Yes." "Professor Ainsworth's program." "Yes." A pause. "Emma can't come with me," Samuel said quietly. "She has the business, the clients. She's been building." He stopped. "She doesn't need to come with you," Nathan said. "She needs to know you're all right without her." Samuel looked at him. "Is she?" he said. "Not about the business, not about Millhaven. She will be," Nathan said. Samuel held his gaze for a count of 3. "You're sure?" Samuel said. "Yes," Nathan said. "I'm sure." Samuel picked up the letter. He held it with both hands and looked at it in the way Nathan had seen him look at his best drawings, with the combination of pride and ownership, and the particular seriousness of a person who understands the weight of what they're holding. "Then I'll write to Ainsworth today," Samuel said. Emma came home at noon. Nathan and Samuel were both there. The letter was on the table. Emma came through the door, saw their faces, looked at the letter, and picked it up without a word. She read it standing in her coat, with the door still not entirely closed behind her. Nathan watched her face. She read it twice. She set it down. She looked at Samuel. "Michigan," she said. "Yes," Samuel said. She nodded. Once. Slow. Then she crossed to Samuel's chair and put her arms around him, and this time she didn't manage it back into composure. She held him for a long time with her face turned away from Nathan and Samuel, who rarely tolerated prolonged embraces held on. Nathan moved to the door. He gave them the room. He stood in the cold outside and thought about a wagon accident on a mountain road, and 2 young people left behind to manage everything on their own, and the 2 years of 16-hour days and engineering textbooks and tips counted into a cloth pouch, and the specific extraordinary quality of a person who builds something entirely from what they have and refuses to apologize for the limitations of the materials. Emma appeared at the door 10 minutes later. Her eyes were dry now. Her expression was composed, but there was a softness underneath the composure that she wasn't working to hide. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." He came inside. Samuel left for Michigan on a gray March morning 4 months later on the Helena-bound stage that stopped in Millhaven every Tuesday and Friday. The night before he left, the three of them ate dinner at the table where Samuel had filled 10,000 with calculations, and they talked until almost midnight about the Clearwater Bridge corrections, which had been formally adopted by the Territorial Engineering Office and credited to S. Larson Consulting Engineer, about Ainsworth's latest letter, which had described a problem in suspension bridge cable geometry that he wanted Samuel's perspective on before the term began, about a joke Samuel made about Ohio engineers that made Emma laugh, the full, unguarded laugh that changed her whole face. Nathan sat across from both of them and thought, "This is what I was looking for. Not just Emma, not just this particular woman, extraordinary as she was, but this, a table-honest conversation, two people who are fully themselves and allow him to be the same. The specific warmth of a room where nothing is being hidden." He had 42,000 acres and railroad shares and a mansion in Helena. He had never until Millhaven understood what wealthy actually meant. In April, Emma signed a 6-month lease on the room behind the general store. Nathan helped her move the cutting table. It required 2 people and some creative angling through the doorframe, and then stood back while she arranged the space with the precise economical efficiency that characterized everything she did. She had 3 bolts of fabric, a dress from her mother's sewing box that had survived the wagon accident, and a small framed paper on which Samuel had sketched a bridge, labeled in his careful engineer's hand, for Emma. "First thing I'm going to build." She hung the framed sketch on the wall behind the cutting table. She stood back and looked at her workroom. "Well," she said. "Well," Nathan agreed. She turned to look at him. "I want to say something," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond." "All right. I know what you want to ask me," she said. "I've known for a while, and I know what my answer is, but I need to say it on my own terms, in my own words, in my own space." She gestured briefly at the workroom. "So." He waited. She looked at him with everything visible, all the layers he had spent months learning to read, present and unguarded simultaneously. "I love you," she said. "I have for longer than I've been willing to say out loud. And when you ask me whatever you're going to ask me..." She paused. "The answer is yes, but we build it the way I build everything, piece by piece, honestly. And nothing gets decided without both of us deciding." He looked at her. "Emma," he said. "Yes." "Can I respond now?" She almost smiled. "Yes." "I was going to ask you to dinner," he said. She looked at him for 1 second. Then she laughed, the full, genuine laugh, the one that changed her whole face. "All right," she said. "Dinner first." He reached into his coat pocket. He had been carrying it for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment, which he had learned from Margaret's sapphire ring, and 4 years of hard lessons meant waiting for the moment that was real rather than the moment that was staged. A small cloth pouch. Not a ring box. Not velvet. Just a plain cloth pouch that he had bought from the general store, because when he thought about what to give Emma Larson and what container it should come in, there had been exactly one answer. He set it on the cutting table between them. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Open it," he said. She picked up the pouch and untied it with the same unhurried practicality she'd shown when she'd placed its predecessor on a dinner table 9 months ago. She looked inside. A ring. Simple, plain gold band, no stone. He had had it made in Helena by a jeweler he'd told specifically, nothing ornate, nothing demonstrative, something a woman who makes things with her hands can wear while she works. Emma held it in her palm. She looked at it for a long moment. "Nathan," she said. "Yes, this is the most sensible ring I've ever seen." "I know," he said. "That's why I chose it." She looked up at him. She turned the ring over once in her palm, The way she turned things over when she was deciding something she'd already decided, just confirming the decision was solid. Then she put it on her right hand, her working hand, the one that moved fabric through a needle 10 hours a day, and held it up. It fit. He had measured her ring size by tracing her discarded thimble at Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house 6 weeks ago. He hadn't told her that. "You measured the thimble," she said. "I did." She looked at him with the expression that lived between exasperation and warmth. "That's either very thoughtful or very unsettling." "I was hoping for thoughtful." "It's both," she said. She lowered her hand. "Yes, Nathan." "Yes to dinner," he said. She met his eyes. "Yes to all of it," she said. "Yeah." They married that autumn in Millhaven, in front of the same 35 people who had watched Nathan stand in the Sunday crowd and tell the truth about himself. Mrs. Caldwell cried. Walt Hollis did not cry, but shook Nathan's hand for considerably longer than a handshake requires. Samuel, home from Michigan for the occasion, sat in his chair at the front of the gathering and watched his sister marry the man who had helped make the room for everything they were both going to become. And his expression held for the duration of the ceremony a quality of satisfaction that was one of the least complicated things Nathan had ever seen on his face. Nathan wore his flannel shirt. Emma wore a dress she had made herself. The ring on her hand was plain gold. It caught the autumn light when she took his hand and held it and didn't let go. Months later, the first real winter of their marriage, with the snow heavy and the ranch alive with the noise of cattle and the work of people who understood this land, Nathan found Emma sitting at the kitchen table in the main house with Samuel's latest letter open in front of her and a cup of tea she'd forgotten to drink. The house was hers now, in the way that a place becomes yours, not through ownership, but through the daily decision to be present in it. Her sewing room was in the east wing, and the clients had followed her from Millhaven 3, now not 1, and the framed bridge sketch was on the wall beside the window, where the morning light came through best. He sat down across from her. "Samuel," he asked. "He's designing a suspension bridge," she said, "for his thesis. He says Professor Ainsworth called it the most technically sophisticated undergraduate proposal he has seen in 30 years of teaching." "Of course he did," Nathan said. She smiled at the letter. "He says he's going to name it after the creek." "Which creek?" "Millhaven." She folded the letter. "He says it's where everything started." Nathan looked at her across the kitchen table, at this woman who had put coins on a table and told him to finish his dinner, who had read engineering textbooks to understand her brother, who had built a workroom from nothing and opened it one piece at a time, and refused at every stage to let love or money or the size of another person's life diminish the exact dimensions of her own. "You know," he said, "I was poor for a long time, before I met you." She looked at him. "You had 42,000 acres." "I had 42,000 acres and nobody I actually trusted," he said. "That's a very specific kind of poor." Emma held his gaze. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the one with the plain gold ring worn now from 6 months of daily work, sitting exactly where it belonged. "You're not poor anymore," she said. He looked at her hand on his. He thought about 25 women and 3 years and a wound dressed as an experiment and a cloth pouch placed on a table without ceremony, and a sentence that had stopped his entire world and started it again. "No," he said, "I'm not." Outside, the Montana winter pressed against the windows, and the cattle moved in the cold, and the land stretched in every direction as far as a man could see. Nathan Cole had 42,000 acres and railroad shares, and a name that opened doors from Helena to Chicago. And sitting across from him, with her hand on his and her brother's letter on the table, and the quiet, absolute certainty of a woman who has built everything she has from the truth, was the only fortune that had ever actually mattered. The richest man in Montana had not found his wealth in the land beneath his feet. He had found it on the evening a woman who owed him nothing placed everything she had on a table and told him without hesitation, without calculation, without a single condition attached, "You'll pay next time. Today we simply finished dinner." And they had.